You're just an old man. Nobody is coming to save you. Derek Vaughn said those words standing in the doorway of a garage that had survived 30 years of Montana winters, laughing as three of his men kicked over a toolbox behind him. William Carter didn't blink. He didn't reach for anything. He just looked at the boy half his age and said quietly, "You have no idea who you're standing in front of." Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes in second chances, in brotherhood, in old men who still have fight left in them, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below, so I know exactly how far this story has traveled to reach you. Now let's go back to the beginning. Silver Creek, Montana wasn't the kind of town that made the news. It was the kind of town where the diner knew your order before you sat down, where the church bell still meant something on Sunday mornings, and where an old man named Will Carter had spent the last 15 years fixing trucks in a garage that smelled like motor oil and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. Nobody in Silver Creek thought twice about Will. He was 70 years old, silver-haired, with hands that shook slightly in the cold mornings, but steadied the second they wrapped around a wrench. He wore flannel shirts even in summer. He gave free oil changes to widows. He let teenagers work off their speeding tickets by sweeping his floors instead of calling their parents. If you asked anyone in town to describe him, they'd use the same three words: quiet, kind, harmless. They were wrong about the last one, but nobody knew that yet. "Morning, Will," said Ray Dobbins, dropping off his pickup for a brake job. "Heard the weather's turning again this weekend." "Always does," Will said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You want the usual in and out by Thursday? You're a lifesaver." "I'm a mechanic, Ray. Don't get poetic on me." That was Will. Simple exchanges, no drama. A man who had built a life out of routine because routine was safe, and safe was something he had chosen a long time ago for reasons nobody in Silver Creek understood. Emily Dawson understood less than most, but she noticed more than anyone. She was 28, blonde, a single mother working double shifts at the Silver Spoon Diner 3 blocks from Will's garage. She'd moved to town 4 years ago with a toddler in a suitcase and not much else. And it was Will who had fixed her car for free that first winter when she couldn't afford the repair and couldn't afford to lose the only vehicle that got her to work. "You don't have to keep bringing me pie every Sunday," Will told her once. "You don't have to keep fixing my car for free," she said back. "So I guess we're both doing things we don't have to do." He'd laughed at that, real laughter, the kind that softened the lines around his eyes. Emily liked making him laugh. It didn't happen often. What she'd noticed for years now, quietly without ever saying anything, was the way Will's eyes moved when he walked into a room, the way he always sat with his back to a wall at the diner facing the door, the way a car backfiring on Main Street once made him go completely still for 2 full seconds before he continued eating like nothing happened. She'd asked him about it once. Old habits was all he said. She hadn't pushed. Some doors you learn not to knock on until the person on the other side is ready to open them. That Tuesday started like any other. Will was under a Ford pickup when he heard the low rumble of an engine that didn't belong to any regular customer. He slid out from under the truck and wiped his hands, already knowing before he saw them that something was wrong. 3 men stepped out of a black SUV, young, confident in the way that only men who'd never actually been tested were confident. The one in front wore a leather jacket too clean to have ever seen real work, gold chain catching the light, a smirk already fixed on his face like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror. Derek Vaughn. Will had heard the name before. Everyone in Silver Creek had by now. 26 years old, the son of a man who used to run legitimate construction contracts before he died and left Derek an inheritance and a taste for control he didn't earn. In the last 8 months, Derek had turned that inheritance into something else entirely, a network of protection that had already swallowed 3 businesses on Main Street. "Mr. Carter," Derek said, stepping into the garage like he owned it, "I've heard a lot about you." "Can't say the same," Will said, setting down his wrench. "That's all right. You'll know plenty about me soon enough." Derek walked slowly around the garage, running a finger along the hood of a car, up on the lift, letting the silence stretch. "See, I've been going around town, talking to business owners, explaining how things work now. And how do things work now? Simple." Derek smiled. "You pay for protection. I make sure nothing bad happens to your garage. Fire, vandalism, trouble with permits. Things a small operation like this can't survive." Will didn't move. "And if I say no?" One of Derek's men, a tall one with a shaved head, stepped closer and kicked over a toolbox sitting near the entrance. Wrenches and sockets scattered across the concrete floor, ringing out like small bells in the sudden quiet. "That's what happens when you say no," the man said. Will looked at the mess on his floor. Then he looked back at Derek, and something in his expression made the tall man take half a step back without quite understanding why. "Pick that up," Will said quietly. Derek laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Excuse me?" "I said pick it up. You made the mess. Clean it." For a moment, nobody moved. Derek's smirk flickered just slightly, just enough for someone paying close attention to catch it before it snapped back into place. "You're funny, old man. I like that. Most people who own businesses in this town, they cry, they beg. You're just standing there like none of this bothers you." Derek leaned in. "You're just an old man. Nobody is coming to save you." Will didn't flinch. He held Derek's gaze with a stillness that seemed to come from somewhere much older than his 70 years, somewhere Derek had never been, and hopefully never would be. "You have no idea who you're standing in front of," Will said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a threat delivered with fists clenched or teeth bared. It was quiet, almost gentle, the way a man might state a fact about the weather. But something about it made the tall man with the shaved head shift his weight, made the third man in the SUV's shadow glance sideways at Derek like he was waiting for permission to leave. Derek recovered fast. He always did. That was one of his gifts, an inability to stay rattled for longer than a few seconds. "Cute line. You practice that in the mirror." He turned toward the door. "You've got until Friday, old man. $500 a week. You'll pay it or you'll watch this place burn down around you." They left the way they came, engine roaring, gravel spraying up behind the tires. Will stood in the doorway and watched the SUV disappear down Main Street, past the hardware store, past the diner, past the church. Then he bent down slowly, his knees protesting the way they always did these days, and began picking up his own scattered tools off the floor. His hands were steady. That was the strange part. A man had just threatened to burn down his life's work, and his hands were as steady as they'd ever been. Word travels fast in a town of 1,100 people, and by that evening, half of Silver Creek knew that Derek Vaughn had paid Will Carter a visit. Emily heard it from Mrs. Whitfield, a 78-year-old widow who lived 2 houses down from the garage and had seen the whole thing from her porch. "They kicked his tools all over the floor," Mrs. Whitfield said, hands wrapped around a cup of tea Emily had brought her. "That boy stood there like a king surveying his kingdom, and Will just stood there and took it." "Will doesn't take anything," Emily said more to herself than to the older woman. "He just doesn't show what he's thinking." She went to the garage after her shift, still in her diner apron, hair coming loose from his ponytail. Will was closing up, pulling the metal door down halfway, and he startled slightly when she called his name, startled in that particular way she'd noticed before, a flinch that resolved itself into calm so fast most people wouldn't have caught it at all. "You heard," he said, not a question. "Whole town heard. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Emily." "Will," she crossed her arms, "you don't have to do the whole stoic mountain man thing with me. A gang leader threatened to burn your garage down. That's not a fine situation." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her the way he sometimes did, like he was deciding how much of himself to let show. "I've dealt with worse than Derek Vaughn," he finally said. "When doesn't matter. It matters to me." Her voice softened. "You've spent years taking care of everyone in this town, Will. Me included. Let someone take care of you for once. Let me call the sheriff at least." Will's jaw tightened just slightly. Sheriff Boyd already knows. He knew about the Hendersons' bakery 2 months ago, too, and the Petrov brothers' auto shop before that, and nothing happened. Why not? Because Derek Vaughn's got money in places that matter, and Boyd's got a pension he doesn't want to lose. Will pulled the garage door the rest of the way down the metal, groaning as it hit the concrete. "This isn't the kind of problem you solve with a phone call to the sheriff." "Then how do you solve it?" Will looked at her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes. Something old. Something tired. Something that made Emily's chest tighten without her understanding exactly why. "You don't," he said quietly. "Sometimes you just survive it until it runs out of reasons to keep going." He didn't say anything else that night. Emily walked home with a strange, uneasy feeling settling into her stomach, the kind of feeling you get when you sense a door in a house you've lived in for years, a door you never noticed was locked. Friday came fast. Will didn't pay. He opened the garage that morning like it was any other day. The coffee pot gurgling a radio, playing low-static country music, a Chevy pickup already up on the lift, waiting for a transmission flush. He told himself he wasn't going to think about it, that he was going to work like he always worked, and for 2 hours it almost felt true. Then the SUV pulled up again, this time with a second car behind it. 4 more men this time. Derek didn't get out right away. He sat in the passenger seat, watching Will through the windshield, with the kind of patience that should have worried Will more than it did. Finally, Derek stepped out. "Deadline was yesterday," he said. "I know what day it is," Will said, not looking up from the transmission fluid he was checking. "Then you know what happens next." Will straightened up, slowly wiped his hands, and finally looked at Derek directly. "You're going to do something you can't take back, over $500 a week from a man who barely clears that after parts and rent. That's the play you want to make." "This was never about the money," Derek said, and for the first time something genuine flickered across his face, something almost like anger that had nothing to do with business. "It's about respect. This whole town used to whisper about my father like he was some kind of failure because he wouldn't play dirty. I'm not making that mistake." "Your father sounds like he was a better man than you," Will said. The garage went very still. Derek's men shifted, waiting for a signal. Derek himself didn't move for a long 3 seconds, his jaw working, and then he smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You know what, old man, I was going to give you until next week. Show a little mercy since you're old, since maybe you're too senile to understand the position you're in." He nodded toward the tall, bald man. "Jesse." Jesse walked past Will toward the back of the garage, toward the workbench where Will kept his tools organized in neat rows he'd maintained for 15 years, a habit from a different life, though nobody in Silver Creek knew that. Jesse picked up a can of gasoline, sitting near the space heater, and without a word began pouring it across the workbench. "No," Will said. His voice cracked just slightly, the first real emotion he'd shown since they arrived. "Should have paid," Derek said. Will moved. It happened faster than a 70-year-old man should have been able to move fast enough that Jesse didn't see it coming, until Will's hand closed around his wrist and twisted hard, sending the gas can clattering to the floor. Jesse yelped in pain and stumbled back, clutching his arm, staring at Will with something between shock and fear. For a moment, nobody in the garage moved. Derek's other men had gone tense, hands hovering near their jackets. Will stood there, breathing hard, his eyes locked on Derek with an intensity that hadn't been there a second ago, something raw and old and dangerous surfacing from somewhere deep beneath the calm, gentle mechanic they thought they knew. "You're stronger than you look, old man," Derek said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. Will didn't answer. He was looking at his own hands like he was surprised by them too. "Get in the car," Derek said to his men backing toward the SUV, eyes still on Will. "This isn't over, Carter. Next time it won't be gasoline on a workbench. It'll be your whole life's work up in smoke, and you along with it if you're stupid enough to be standing here." They left in a spray of gravel faster than they'd arrived. Will stood alone in the garage for a long time after the sound of engines faded, staring at the gas can, lying on its side on the concrete floor. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from something else entirely, something that had been buried for a decade and had just cracked open a fraction of an inch. He picked up the walkie, set it upright, wiped down the workbench with an old rag. His movements mechanical, practiced the way a man moves when his body knows what to do, even when his mind is somewhere far away. That night, for the first time in 10 years, Will Carter opened the bottom drawer of his dresser, the one he never opened, the one underneath 3 folded flannel shirts he never wore, and looked down at an old cigar box he hadn't touched since he moved to Silver Creek. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just stared at it, his weathered hand resting on the lid, his jaw tight, his breathing slow and controlled in the way of a man forcing himself to stay calm. Then he closed the drawer and went to bed, and if anyone had been able to see his face in the dark, they would have seen something Silver Creek had never seen on William Carter before. Fear. Not for himself, for what he might have to become again. The next morning, Emily came by the garage with coffee and found Will already there. Though the shop wasn't due to open for another hour, he was sitting on an overturned bucket near the entrance, staring at nothing, a mug of cold coffee forgotten in his hands. "Will," he looked up, and for a split second before he composed himself, Emily saw something in his face that scared her more than anything Derek Vaughn had done. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like grief. Old grief, the kind that never fully heals, just gets better at hiding. I'm all right, he said, standing up too quickly, brushing past whatever had been sitting on his face a moment before. You don't look all right. You look like you saw a ghost. Something like that, he muttered. Will talk to me, please. Emily set the coffee down on the workbench and stepped closer. You twisted a grown man's arm yesterday like it was nothing. Mrs. Whitfield told me, she said you moved so fast, she almost didn't believe what she saw. Where did that come from? Will was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, careful, like each word cost him something. There are parts of my life I left behind a long time ago, Emily. Parts I didn't think I'd ever need again. What kind of parts? He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed to actually consider telling her the truth. Really telling her, not deflecting, not changing the subject the way he always did. His mouth opened slightly. Then the bell above the garage door jingled, and Ray Dobbins walked in asking about his brakes, and the moment closed like a fist. Later, Will said quietly to Emily before turning to greet Ray with a voice that gave away nothing at all. Ray, brakes are done. Let me grab your keys. Emily watched him walk away, and the uneasy feeling in her stomach from days before hardened into something more solid. Something was coming. She didn't know what yet, but she could feel it building, the way you feel a storm gathering, before the first drop of rain ever falls. Pressure in the air, a stillness that wasn't peace but the held breath before something breaks. Over the next several days, Derek Vaughn's presence in Silver Creek grew heavier, like a shadow lengthening as the sun went down. The hardware store owner, an anxious man named Pete Alvarez, started closing early, refusing to meet anyone's eyes when they asked why. The Henderson's Bakery, which had already been paying Derek for 2 months, raised their prices to cover the cost, and the whole town understood why without anyone saying it out loud. Sheriff Boyd, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had once been well-liked, started avoiding Main Street entirely, taking the back roads on his patrol route, filing paperwork that never seemed to result in anything. There's no direct evidence linking Vaughn to any crime, he told a furious Pete Alvarez at a town meeting held in the back room of the church. Everything's word of mouth, circumstantial. My hands are tied. Your hands are tied because you don't want to untie them, Pete snapped. Watch your tone, Boyd said, but there was no real force behind it, just tiredness, just a man who had already decided somewhere along the way that this wasn't a fight he was willing to have. Will sat in the back of that meeting silent, listening to 11 business owners and 40 townspeople talk in circles about a problem none of them had the power to solve. He watched fear pass from face to face like a virus watched people who had known each other their whole lives grow suspicious of one another, wondering who might be the next to break, who might start informing to Derek's crew just to protect their own families. When the meeting ended and people began filing out into the cold evening air, Mrs. Whitfield approached Will, her cane tapping against the church floor. You were quiet tonight, William. Wasn't much to say that hasn't already been said. You could have told them what you did to that boy in your garage. Might have given some of them a little hope. Will's expression tightened. That's not something I want people talking about. Why not? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was so quiet only she could hear it. Because it means I'd have to explain who taught me how to do it. And that's a door I promised myself I'd never open again. Mrs. Whitfield studied him for a long moment, with the kind of clarity that only comes with age, with having buried a husband, and outlived most of her friends, with having learned to read the weight behind a person's silence. Sometimes, William, she said gently, the doors we lock hardest are the ones that were built to save us. She left him standing alone in the empty church, her words settling into him like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples he couldn't quite track. 3 days later, everything changed. It started small. Will arrived at the garage just after dawn, the way he always did, to find the front window smashed and red spray paint scrawled across the metal roll door in letters 2 feet tall, last warning. He stood there for a long time, staring at the words, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Then he heard the scream. It came from 2 doors down from Mrs. Whitfield's small yellow house, the one with the porch where she drank her tea every morning at exactly 7 o'clock. Will was running before he consciously decided to run, his 70-year-old knees screaming in protest, adrenaline burning through his veins in a way he hadn't felt in a decade. He found Jesse, the tall, bald man, from before, standing in Mrs. Whitfield's front yard, and the old woman herself on the ground near her porch steps, clutching her wrist, her face pale with pain and shock. She wasn't paying attention, Jesse said, backing away with his hands raised, though his voice carried no real remorse. I was just talking to her. She tripped. You put your hands on her, Will said, and his voice had changed completely. Gone was the gentle mechanic, replaced by something cold and precise and utterly without mercy. I didn't touch her, old man, she... Will crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and had Jesse by the collar before the younger man could finish his sentence, slamming him back against the porch railing hard enough to crack the old wood. You listen to me very carefully, Will said, his voice low and shaking with a fury Silver Creek had never seen from him. You go near her again. You go near anyone in this town again. And what happened to your wrist the other day is going to feel like a gentle handshake compared to what I do to you. Is that a threat? Jesse managed, despite the fear plain on his face. It's a promise, Will said, and I don't break promises. He released Jesse, who scrambled back toward a parked car at the curb, shooting one last frightened glance over his shoulder before speeding off. Will turned immediately to Mrs. Whitfield, kneeling beside her, his hands gentle, now checking her wrist with the careful precision of someone who had once been trained to assess injuries under far worse circumstances. It's not broken, he said softly, just a bad sprain. I've got you. William, she whispered, gripping his arm with her good hand, tears in her eyes, not from the pain, but from something else. That boy, the way you looked at him. I know. That wasn't the man who fixes my porch light every spring. Will's jaw tightened, and for a moment, kneeling there in the cold morning air, with an old woman's blood pressure spiking under his careful fingers, something in him finally broke free of the cage he'd built around it for 10 long years. No, he admitted quietly. It wasn't. He helped her inside, made sure she was settled, called Emily to come sit with her while he went to deal with the sheriff about what had happened. But something had shifted in him, something Silver Creek could feel, even if they couldn't name it. The gentle old mechanic who kept his head down and asked for nothing was gone, at least for now, replaced by someone harder, someone the town had never met. That night, Will didn't go home right away. He sat in his darkened garage long after closing, staring at the vandalized door outside at the words, "Last Warning," still visible, even in the dim light bleeding in from the street lamp outside. He thought about Mrs. Whitfield's wrist, about Jesse's hands on an old woman who had done nothing but exist in the wrong place at the wrong time, about Derek Vaughn's cold, empty eyes and the way he talked about respect like it was something you could steal instead of earn. And he thought for the first time in a decade about the men he used to ride with, about leather and chrome and the particular sound of 40 engines starting at once, a sound like thunder rolling across open highway, about a promise he'd made to himself the day he rode into Silver Creek and hung up his vest for good, a promise that he was done, that this quiet life was penance enough, that he would never again need the family he'd left behind. He thought about Marcus, preacher. The name alone made something ache deep in Will's chest, a wound that had never fully closed that he had spent 10 years pretending was scar tissue instead of an open cut. Will went home. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time before finally opening the bottom drawer of his dresser, moving aside the 3 folded flannel shirts and lifting out the old cigar box he hadn't touched since he arrived in Silver Creek. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were photographs yellowed with age. Younger versions of himself standing beside motorcycles that gleamed even in faded color, wearing a leather vest with patches Emily had never seen, surrounded by men who looked at the camera like brothers, like the kind of family you don't choose but somehow end up needing more than blood. And beneath the photographs, folded carefully, a single scrap of paper with a phone number, written in handwriting that wasn't his own handwriting. He recognized instantly. Handwriting that belonged to a man he hadn't spoken to in 10 years. A man he'd promised himself he would never call because calling meant admitting he still needed that. Life still needed that brotherhood, still wasn't strong enough to survive on his own. Will sat there for a long time, the phone number trembling slightly in his weathered hand, an old rotary phone sitting on his nightstand like it had been waiting for this exact moment for a decade. Outside, somewhere across town, Derek Vaughn was already planning his next move, already deciding that an old man's defiance needed to be answered with something Silver Creek would never forget. Will didn't know that yet, but some old instinct, some part of him that had never fully gone quiet no matter how many years he tried to bury it, told him that time was running out. He picked up the phone. His finger hovered over the rotary dial, shaking slightly, 10 years of silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, in a garage that smelled of leather and engine grease, a phone began to ring on a cluttered desk covered in motorcycle parts and old photographs of men who had ridden together for 30 years. A gruff, weathered voice picked up on the third ring. Preacher's garage. Will's throat tightened. 10 years of silence sat heavy on his tongue, and for a moment he couldn't find a single word. Who is this? The voice asked again, sharper this time, sensing something in the silence on the other end of the line. Will closed his eyes. It's Will. The line went completely silent. It's Will. 3 words. 10 years of silence broken by 3 words, and on the other end of the line, Marcus Preacher Hayes went so quiet that for a moment Will wondered if the call had dropped. Say that again. Preacher finally said, his voice rough, like gravel dragged across concrete. It's Will Preacher. Will Carter. Yeah. Another silence, longer this time. Will could hear something in the background on the other end, a wrench dropping maybe, or a chair scraping back fast. 10 years, Preacher said. 10 years, brother, and you call me on a Tuesday night like we talked last week. I know. You don't call, you don't write. Sarah tried 3 times to reach you after. Preacher stopped himself, and Will felt the unfinished sentence land like a fist to the chest anyway. We thought you were dead half the time. Other half, we figured you just didn't want to be found. I didn't, Will admitted. His voice cracked on the second word, and he hated himself for it. I didn't want to be found, Preacher. I needed to not be found. You understand that better than anyone. I understand grief, Will. I understand a man burying his brother and needing time. I don't understand a man disappearing off the face of the earth for 10 years and cutting off everyone who loved him like we were the problem. You weren't the problem. Will pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, the cigar box open beside him, old photographs spilling across the quilt. I was. Every time I looked at any of you, I saw him. I saw Tommy. I couldn't. His voice gave out completely. On the other end, Preacher exhaled long and slow. And when he spoke again, some of the anger had drained out of his voice, replaced by something heavier. I know, brother. I know what you saw. I saw it too, every damn day for a year after. That's why none of us blamed you for needing to go quiet. We just wished you'd gone quiet somewhere we could still reach you. I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me at midnight on a phone call 10 years too late. Apologize by telling me why you're calling now. Will's hand tightened around the receiver. This was the part he'd been dreading since he picked up the phone, the part where he had to admit that after 10 years of building a wall so high nobody could climb it, he was the one asking for a ladder. There's trouble here, Will said quietly. In the town I settled in, a gang. Kid running it thinks he owns the place. He's been extorting business owners, and when I wouldn't pay, he sent his people to burn my garage down. Yesterday they hurt an old woman, 78 years old, Preacher. Broke her wrist just for being in his way. And the police? Compromised or scared or both. Sheriff's got nothing solid, and I don't think he's looking very hard for it either. Preacher's voice went flat and dangerous. The tone Will remembered from 100 nights on the road, the tone that meant Preacher had already stopped weighing options and started making decisions. Give me the address. Preacher. Give me the address, Will. I didn't call you to bring the whole club down on some kid's head. Will stood up, pacing now, the old floorboards creaking under his bare feet. I called because I needed to hear your voice, because I've been standing in front of this thing alone for 2 weeks, and I forgot what it felt like to not be alone. You were never supposed to be alone, Preacher said, and something in his voice made Will's throat close up. That's the whole damn point of what we built, brother. You think 10 years changes that. You think because you went quiet, the promise went quiet too. Will didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice. I'm not asking your permission, Preacher continued. I'm telling you what's happening. I'm calling Hollis. I'm calling Big Mike. I'm calling every single man who ever called you brother, and we are coming to wherever the hell you disappeared to, and we are ending whatever this is. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Preacher's voice cracked just slightly, just enough for Will to hear the 10 years of missing him underneath the anger. You called me Will. After 10 years of nothing, you picked up a phone at midnight and called me. You think I'm going to let that be a casual conversation? You think I'm gonna say good luck and hang up? Will sat back down on the edge of the bed, defeated in the best possible way, something in his chest loosening for the first time in 2 weeks. Silver Creek, he said quietly. Montana, small town maybe 2 hours south of Missoula. We'll find it. Preacher. Will's voice was barely above a whisper now. I don't deserve this. After everything. After how I left. You don't get to decide what you deserve, brother. That's not how family works. A pause and then softer. It's good to hear your voice, Will. It's been too long. Yeah, Will said, and for the first time in 10 years, he let himself smile through the ache in his chest. It has. They talked for another 20 minutes, logistics names Will hadn't heard spoken aloud in a decade, a running count of who was still riding and who had passed and who had kids old enough now to ride themselves. By the time Will hung up the phone, his hands were shaking, but not from fear this time. He sat alone in his dark bedroom for a long while, looking down at the photographs scattered across his bed. A younger version of himself grinned back up at him from a faded print, one arm slung around a man with wild eyes and a wider grin, Tommy. 24 years old in the photograph, forever 24, because that's how old he'd been the night everything went wrong. Will touched the edge of the photo gently, like it might tear if he pressed too hard. I hope you'd understand, he whispered to the empty room. I hope you wouldn't hate me for waiting this long. The room, of course, said nothing back. 2 miles away, Emily Dawson lay awake in her small, rented house, her 4-year-old son Cooper, asleep in the next room, her mind circling the same question it had circled for days now. Who was Will Carter really? She'd seen the way he moved when Jesse showed up at Mrs. Whitfield's house, fast, precise, almost frightening in how controlled it was. She'd seen the look on his face afterward, like a man who had just remembered something about himself he'd spent years trying to forget. And she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening now, whatever Derek Vaughn was stirring up in their quiet little town, it was about to collide with something much bigger than a protection racket. She'd promised herself she wouldn't push, that she'd let Will tell her in his own time. But sitting there in the dark, listening to her son's soft breathing through the thin wall, Emily made a different promise instead. If Will Carter was carrying some kind of danger into their lives, into her son's life, she deserved to know exactly what it was. The next morning, she went to the garage before her shift, coffee in hand, and found Will already there, but different somehow. Lighter. Like a weight had shifted off his shoulders overnight, even though the vandalized door still read, "Last warning" in fading red paint. You look like you slept for the first time in a week, she said, handing him the coffee. Something like that. He took the cup, his hands steadier than she'd seen them in days. Care to tell me why? Will hesitated, and in that hesitation, Emily saw an opening, and she took it without apology. Well, I need you to level with me. I've known you 4 years. You fixed my car when I couldn't afford groceries. You've been more of a grandfather to Cooper than his own grandfather ever was. I think I've earned the truth. Will set the coffee down, slowly staring at it like it might give him the courage he needed. When he finally looked up, something had settled in his expression, a decision made. Sit down, he said. This is going to take a while. She sat on an overturned bucket across from him, her heart hammering. Before I came to Silver Creek, Will began, I wasn't a mechanic in a small town. I was a soldier. 2 tours, both ugly, and when I came home, I wasn't the same man who left. Couldn't sleep, couldn't be in crowds, couldn't hear a car backfire without hitting the ground. You know what that's called now? They've got a name for it. They've got treatment for it. Back then, we just called it broken and left it at that. Will, let me finish. He took a breath. I found some other men like me, not through some VA program, through a motorcycle club. Men who'd seen what I'd seen, carried what I carried. We rode together, we fixed each other's engines and each other's minds best we could. They became my family, Emily. More than family some days. Brothers I chose. What club? Will held her gaze steady. Hell's Angels. Emily's breath caught. Whatever she'd been braced for, it wasn't that, not the version of the club she'd heard about in movies and news segments, all violence and lawlessness. Not connected to the gentle old man who fixed her car for free and remembered Cooper's birthday every year. I know what you've heard, Will said, reading her face. I know the reputation. Some of it's earned, I won't pretend otherwise. It's not a Sunday school picnic. In some chapters, some men, they lived up to every bad thing people say. But the men I rode with the family, I found they were the reason I survived coming home from war. They didn't judge me for waking up screaming. They just handed me a wrench and told me to fix something until the shaking stopped. So what happened? Why did you leave? Will's face changed completely. Then the openness closing, something raw and grieving surfacing in its place. His name was Tommy, Will said quietly. Tommy Reyes, 24 years old. I was supposed to be looking out for him. He'd only been riding with us a year. Still had that green kid energy. Still thought he was invincible. We got caught up in something ugly. A rival crew, a deal gone bad, doesn't matter the details. What matters is I made a call that night. A tactical call, the kind I used to make overseas without thinking twice. And it got him killed. Well, it was my call, Emily. His voice was flat now, controlled in the way that told her he'd said these words to himself 1,000 times before ever saying them out loud to another person. I told him to go left. Rival crew was waiting on the left. I've replayed that 10 seconds every single night for 10 years, and every single time I still tell him to go left because that's what my training said, that's what the tactics said, and every single time he still dies. Emily reached out and took his hand, her own trembling slightly. Will let her. I couldn't stay after that, he continued. Couldn't look at his mother at the funeral. Couldn't look at my brothers, knowing every one of them was thinking the same thing I was thinking, even if they never said it out loud. So I left, packed a bag, rode until the bike ran out of gas outside a little town called Silver Creek, and I just stopped. Sold the bike, cut my hair, became a mechanic instead of a soldier, instead of a rider, instead of anything that might get someone else killed. And last night, Emily asked softly, the phone call I heard when I walked past your window. Will looked at her with something like relief, like confessing had lightened a burden he'd carried alone for far too long. I called Preacher, he said. My old brother. First time in 10 years. Why now? Because Derek Vaughn hurt Mrs. Whitfield. Because he's going to keep hurting people in this town until somebody stops him, and Sheriff Boyd's not going to be the one to do it. And because Will's voice softened, something almost like shame flickering across his weathered face. Because I finally understood that hiding from my past doesn't make me safer. It just makes everyone around me less safe. Emily sat with that for a long moment, processing everything. The war, the club, the guilt, the decade of self-imposed exile. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. So they're coming, your brothers. Preacher said he wasn't giving me a choice. A ghost of a smile crossed Will's face. Said the promise doesn't go quiet just because I did. Will, Emily squeezed his hand. I'm not scared of who you were. I'm scared of what Derek's going to do when he finds out bikers are coming to Silver Creek. That's not a de-escalation, Will. That's throwing gasoline on a fire that's already burning. Will's jaw tightened. I know. Do you? Emily, I've spent 10 years running from confrontation because I was scared of what I might do, what I might become again. But Mrs. Whitfield's wrist is in a brace right now because I hesitated too long, because I tried to handle this the quiet, peaceful way, and it wasn't enough. Sometimes peace isn't a choice you get to make alone. Sometimes it's something you have to fight for. Before Emily could respond, the garage bell jingled and both of them turned toward the door, tension immediately snapping back into their bodies. It was Sheriff Boyd, alone, hat in his hands, looking like a man who hadn't slept well in days. Will, he said, got a minute? Depends what for. Boyd glanced at Emily, then back at Will, hesitating. Alone might be better. She stays, Will said firmly. Whatever you've got to say, Emily hears it too. Boyd sighed, running a hand over his tired face. Fine. Word's gotten around that you made some calls last night, long distance, to some old contacts. Will went very still. How would you know that? Because Derek Vaughn's got someone at the phone company feeding him information, Will. That's how deep this goes. He knew about your call before the sun came up this morning. Boyd's expression was grim, and he's not happy about it. Emily felt her stomach drop. What did he say? He didn't say anything to me directly, but he had one of his men deliver a message to my office this morning. Boyd pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, hands trembling slightly as he handed it to Will. Found it taped to my door. Will unfolded the paper. His face went pale, then hardened into something cold and furious. Emily leaned over to read it, and her blood ran cold. Tell your biker friend his little phone calls don't scare me. Tell him whatever gang he thinks he's bringing to town. I've got friends too. Friends with real power, the kind that make bikers look like Boy Scouts. He's got until Sunday to call it off, or the next person who gets hurt won't be an old lady with a sprained wrist. Sunday, Will said quietly, 3 days. Well, this is escalating fast. Boyd said, his voice tight with something that might have been fear, might have been guilt. I need you to understand, if this turns into some kind of war between your old club and Derek's crew, people are going to get hurt. Innocent people. This town can't survive that. You think I don't know that? Will's voice rose for the first time sharp enough that Boyd took a half step back. You think I called my brothers because I wanted a war sheriff? I called them because your department's done nothing for 2 months while Derek terrorized every business on Main Street. I called them because an old woman's wrist is broken and you've got no arrests, no charges, nothing but paperwork that goes nowhere. Boyd flinched like he'd been struck. That's not fair, isn't it? The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. When he looked back up, something had shifted in his face, an admission maybe, or the beginning of one. You want to know why my hands are tied, Will? Why every case against Derek falls apart before it reaches a judge? His voice dropped low. Derek's not working alone. He's got backing. Money connections, someone higher up pulling strings to keep this town locked down. I've tried 3 times to build a real case. 3 times evidence disappeared, witnesses recanted, and once he stopped himself. Once what? Emily pressed. Boyd's jaw worked. Once I got a call at 2 in the morning. Man's voice I didn't recognize. Told me my daughter walks to school alone every morning at 7:15. Didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. The garage went silent, the weight of that admission settling over all 3 of them. So you back off, Will said quietly, because they threatened your kid. Wouldn't you? Boyd's eyes were wet now, years of shame finally breaking loose. I took an oath, Will. I know what I'm supposed to do, but I've got a 9-year-old daughter and I couldn't live with myself if something happened to her because I decided to be a hero. Emily watched Will's expression soften, the anger draining into something more complicated, understanding maybe mixed with a deeper resolve. I'm not judging you, Boyd, Will said finally. You're a father protecting your kid. I get that better than most people ever could. But that's exactly why I made that call last night. Because somebody in this town needs to be able to stand up to Derek Vaughn without worrying about what happens to their family. And my brothers, his voice caught slightly, my brothers don't have anyone Derek can threaten. Most of them don't have kids walking to school. Most of them have already lost everything they were ever afraid of losing. Boyd studied him for a long moment. You really think a bunch of aging bikers can stand up to whoever's backing Derek? I think, Will said slowly, that Derek Vaughn has spent his whole life confusing fear for respect, and I think he's about to learn the difference the hard way. After Boyd left, Emily turned to Will, her mind racing. Will this note friends with real power? What does that mean? Who's backing Derek? I don't know yet, Will admitted, but I intend to find out. How? Will's expression turned thoughtful, calculating in a way Emily hadn't seen from him before the soldier surfacing again beneath the mechanic's weathered face. Derek's 26 years old, he said. Inherited money from his father, but not this kind of operation. Extortion rings, corrupted phone company contacts, someone willing to threaten a sheriff's daughter, that's not amateur hour. That takes real infrastructure, real money. Someone experienced is guiding him. You think someone's using him? I think Derek believes he's the one in control, Will said, and I think he's about to find out how wrong he is from more than one direction. That afternoon, while Will worked in the garage trying to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied, Emily made a decision of her own. She left Cooper with her neighbor and drove to the county records office 20 minutes outside Silver Creek, determined to dig up whatever she could find about Derek Vaughn's father and the construction business he'd left behind. What she found made her blood run cold. Derek's father, Harold Vaughn, hadn't just run a construction company. Public records showed a string of contracts with the county going back 15 years on contracts for roadwork, municipal buildings permits that required sign-off from local officials. And threaded through those records, one name kept appearing again and again in approval signatures. Councilman Gerald Ashford, the same Gerald Ashford who currently sat on Silver Creek's town council. The same Gerald Ashford who had just 2 months ago publicly praised new investment opportunities coming to Main Street without ever naming a source. Emily's hands were shaking as she photographed the documents on her phone. This wasn't just a punk kid running a protection racket. This was something rooted deep in the town's own government, something that had probably been growing quietly for years before Derek ever picked up where his father left off. She drove straight back to the garage, breaking the speed limit the whole way, and burst through the door just as Will was closing up for the evening. "Well, I found something." "Emily, what?" "Councilman Ashford. He's connected to Derek's father's old business. 15 years of contracts, permits, approvals, and now he's the one talking up investment opportunities on Main Street right when Derek starts his extortion racket." She thrust her phone toward him, hands still trembling. "This isn't just some kid with a gang, Will. This is corruption running straight through town hall." Will took the phone, scrolling through the photographs with a grim, focused expression, the last piece of gentle mechanic falling away entirely as he processed what he was looking at. "This is exactly the kind of backing that lets a 26-year-old threaten a sheriff's family and make evidence disappear," he said quietly. "This explains everything. What do we do with it?" Will handed the phone back to her, his jaw set. "Right now, nothing. If Ashford's as deep in this as it looks, going to the wrong authority could get this evidence buried or get you hurt trying to expose it. We need this information to matter, Emily, and right now we don't have anyone we can trust to hand it to. So we just sit on it. We sit on it until we have enough power behind us that burying evidence isn't an option anymore." Will's eyes were steady, resolute. "My brothers will be here soon. When they arrive, this town is going to have protection it hasn't had in months. And once Derek and whoever's backing him realize they can't threaten their way out of this, that's when we bring this evidence forward, when there's nobody left to intimidate into silence." Emily nodded slowly, though the fear hadn't fully left her eyes. "Will, promise me something. Anything. Promise me Cooper's safe. Promise me whatever happens between you and Derek, whatever your brothers bring with them when they arrive, promise me my son doesn't become collateral damage in some old grudge." Will's expression softened, and he reached out gently, squeezing her shoulder in a gesture so paternal, it made Emily's throat tighten. "I promise you, Emily, I did not survive 2 wars and lose my brother just to let harm come to that little boy. You and Cooper are safe. I'll make sure of it, no matter what it costs me." That night, as Silver Creek settled into an uneasy darkness, 3 separate scenes played out that would set the next several days in motion. In a modest ranch house on the edge of town, Sheriff Boyd sat at his kitchen table long after his wife and daughter had gone to bed, staring at a case file he'd built and rebuilt a dozen times, trying to find the courage to make one more attempt at real justice, no matter the personal cost. In Derek Vaughn's rented house on the nicer side of town, a house paid for with money that had never quite made sense given his modest inheritance, Derek sat across from a man Emily's record search hadn't yet uncovered, a man who spoke in low, measured tones about patience, about long games, about how an old biker and his friends were nothing but a minor inconvenience in a plan that had been building for years. "He's calling in reinforcements," Derek said, pacing. "Bikers. Could be a dozen of them, could be more." "Let them come," the man said calmly, swirling a glass of whiskey he hadn't yet touched. "Bikers make noise. Noise draws attention. And attention handled correctly can work in our favor just as easily as it works against us. What if they cause real trouble? Then real trouble finds a way to become someone else's fault." The man smiled, cold and patient. "You let me worry about optics, Derek. You worry about making sure that old man understands exactly how much he stands to lose." And 200 miles away, in a garage lit by fluorescent lights and filled with the low rumble of engines being prepped, 17 members of the Hells Angels loaded saddlebags, checked tire pressure, and said quiet goodbyes to wives and children preparing to ride at dawn toward a town most of them had never heard of, for a brother most of them hadn't seen in a decade, because that was what the promise meant. And the promise didn't go quiet, not ever, not for anyone. Preacher stood in the middle of it all, checking his own bike. One final time, his weathered face set with a grim determination that his brothers hadn't seen in years. "You really think this old man's worth all this?" one of the younger riders asked a man in his 30s who joined the club only 5 years earlier and had never met Will Carter. Preacher looked at him with an intensity that made the younger man take a step back. "Let me tell you something about William Carter," Preacher said. 10 years ago, that man carried three of us out of an ambush that should have killed all four. 2 years before that, he sat with me for 6 straight months after I lost my youngest boy to leukemia, never left my side, never said a word unless I wanted him to. That man has bled for this club more times than most of you have bled for anything in your entire lives. The younger rider fell silent. So yeah, Preacher said, swinging his leg over his bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him like a promise finally being kept. He's worth it, every mile. By morning, 17 motorcycles were on the road, engines thundering across empty Montana highway, heading toward a small town that had no idea what was coming. Back in Silver Creek, Will woke before dawn, unable to sleep his mind, cycling through everything Emily had uncovered the day before Ashford's connections, the note left on Boyd's door, the deadline hanging over all of them, like a blade waiting to fall. He dressed quietly and walked to the garage in the pre-dawn darkness, needing the familiar comfort of work to steady his racing thoughts. He didn't expect to find Derek Vaughn already there waiting for him, leaning against the vandalized door with two of his men flanking him, faces grim in the gray morning light. Couldn't sleep either, old man, Derek asked. Will stopped several feet away, every muscle in his body going tense and alert. What do you want, Derek? I want you to understand something. Derek pushed off the door, stepping closer, his earlier arrogance replaced by something colder, more calculated. You made a call 2 nights ago. I know who you called. I know what you used to bump on. Will's expression didn't change, though his heart began pounding harder in his chest. Then you know this isn't going to end the way you think it will. Actually, Derek said, a slow smile spreading across his face. I think it's going to end exactly the way I planned it from the beginning. You see, old man, I did my research too. Hell's Angels. Quite the reputation. Quite the history of violence, actually the kind of history that makes for very convincing headlines when things go wrong in a small town. A cold dread began forming in Will's stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying that when your biker friends roll into Silver Creek and something happens, anything happens, an accident, a fight, doesn't matter what the story's already written. Dangerous gang descends on peaceful small town, chaos ensues, law-abiding citizens caught in the crossfire. Derek's smile widened. And who do you think the police, the media, the whole world is going to believe? A 70-year-old mechanic in his outlaw biker gang, or a respected young businessman just trying to protect his community? Will's hands curled into fists. You're setting us up. I'm giving you a choice, Derek corrected. Call them off right now. Tell them to turn around, go home, forget Silver Creek exists, and maybe I let this whole thing go back to simple protection payments. Business as usual. And if I don't, Derek's expression turned genuinely dangerous, for the first time all pretense of youthful bravado gone, replaced by something far more calculating and far more dangerous. Then when your brothers arrive, he said quietly, they're going to find out that I've already made sure this town sees them as the villains before they even take their helmets off. And trust me, old man, once that narrative takes hold, there won't be a courtroom, a sheriff, or a news camera in this state that sides with a bunch of aging outlaws over the poor terrorized citizens of Silver Creek. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder with cold satisfaction. You've got until they cross the town line, Will. After that, it's out of your hands completely. Will stood alone in front of his garage as the sun finally broke over the mountains, the weight of Derek's threat settling into his chest like a stone. Somewhere on the highway, 17 motorcycles were already thundering towards Silver Creek, carrying men who had dropped everything to answer his call. Completely unaware, they were riding straight into a trap being carefully constructed to destroy them before they ever arrived. His hand trembled as he pulled out his phone, dialing Preacher's number with fingers that felt clumsy and slow. The call went straight to voicemail. Will stared at the phone, dread pooling cold and heavy in his stomach, the reality settling in with brutal clarity. They were already on the road, already committed, already riding directly into whatever trap Derek Vaughn and his hidden backers had spent weeks preparing. And there was nothing Will could do now but wait and hope and pray that the family he'd spent 10 years running from wouldn't pay the price for finally answering his call. Will tried the number 4 more times before finally giving up on reaching Preacher directly. Instead, he dialed the garage line, the one that had picked up 2 nights ago, the one with a landline extension he remembered from a decade back that might still ring through to whoever was minding the shop. Nobody answered. The line just rang and rang into an empty building 200 miles away. He stood in the middle of his own garage, phone gripped so tight his knuckles had gone white, and forced himself to think instead of panic. Preacher wouldn't have driven off without a plan. Preacher had led that club through worse than a small-town extortion racket, through federal investigations, through territory wars, through funerals that should have broken lesser men. If anyone could smell a setup coming, it was him. But knowing that didn't slow Will's heartbeat down even a little. Will? He turned to find Emily standing in the doorway. Cooper's hand in hers, her face tight with a fear that told him she'd already sensed something was wrong before he said a word. "You look like you're about to be sick," she said. "Derek was here this morning," Will said. "Before you arrived. He knows about the call. He knows who I called." Emily's face drained of color. "How?" "Doesn't matter how. What matters is what he told me." Will's jaw worked, the words feeling like broken glass in his mouth. "He's already laid the groundwork to make my brothers look like the villains the second they cross the town line. Cameras, a narrative, something. He's not scared of them showing up, Emily. He's counting on it. So call them. Tell them to turn around." "I've tried." Preacher's not answering. Will's hand tightened around the phone again. "They're already on the road, probably somewhere between here and Missoula right now, and I have no way to warn them." Cooper tugged at his mother's sleeve, sensing the tension in the room, even if he didn't understand it, and Emily crouched down instinctively to comfort him, her eyes never leaving Will's face. "What do we do?" she asked. Will exhaled slowly, forcing the soldier in him to override the panic. "We prepare the town. If Derek's planning something visual, something for cameras, we need eyes on every angle he might use. And we need Boyd." "Boyd's compromised. Well, you said so yourself." "Boyd's scared," Will corrected. "There's a difference. Scared men can still choose to be brave when it matters enough." He grabbed his jacket off the hook by the door, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead, the tactical clarity of his old life resurfacing with startling speed. "I need you to take Cooper somewhere safe, not home. Somewhere Derek wouldn't think to look." "Well, you're scaring me." "Good," he said, and for once he didn't soften it. "Because I need you scared enough to listen to me right now. Whatever's about to happen in this town today, I don't want you or your son anywhere near it." Emily's eyes welled up, but she nodded, gathering Cooper into her arms, despite his protest, moving toward the door with the kind of urgency that came from trusting someone completely, even when trusting them terrified her. "Will," she said, pausing at the threshold, "be careful, please." "I will," he said, and then quieter almost to himself. "I have to be. I've already lost one family. I'm not losing another." She left, and Will stood alone in the garage for exactly 10 seconds before he grabbed his keys and headed for the sheriff's office, cutting through back alleys instead of Main Street, his old instincts screaming at him to stay off open ground. He found Boyd at his desk, the same case file from the night before still spread out in front of him. Dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he hadn't slept at all. "Will." Boyd looked up startled. "What's wrong?" "Derek knows about my call. He's planning to frame my club the second they arrive, set up some kind of incident, make it look like they're the aggressors, get it on camera control, the story before anyone else can." Will planted both hands on the desk, leaning in. "I need to know if you're still the man who took that oath, or if you're the man who's going to sit behind this desk while a good group of people gets destroyed by a lie." Boyd's jaw tightened, old shame flickering behind his eyes. For a moment, Will thought he was going to get another excuse, another retreat into fear. Instead, Boyd stood up. "What do you need from me?" Relief flooded through Will so fast it nearly buckled his knees. "I need you visible. I need you at the town line when they arrive in uniform, in your own words, telling whatever story unfolds honestly, not whatever version Derek's already written for the cameras. I need at least one person with a badge who isn't in his pocket. And if this goes bad, if shots get fired, if..." "It won't," Will said with more certainty than he actually felt. "These aren't the men the movies make them out to be. They're fathers, veterans, mechanics, men who've buried more friends than most people bury in 3 lifetimes. They're not coming here for violence. They're coming here because I asked for help, and that's it." Boyd studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted the fear still there, but something steadier underneath it now. Something that looked almost like the man he used to be before Derek Vaughn's threats had worn him down to nothing. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Will. Let's do this the right way." They left the office together, and for the first time in weeks, Will felt something other than dread pushing through his chest, something almost like hope. It didn't last long. Halfway to Main Street, Will's phone rang. Unknown number. "Carter," he answered. "You should have called them off, old man." Derek's voice cold and smug. "Turn on Channel 4. Local news crew's already set up at the diner." Funny how fast word travels when the right person makes a phone call. Will's stomach dropped. "What did you do?" "I told them Silver Creek's about to be invaded by an outlaw motorcycle gang," Derek said, savoring every word. "Told them a peaceful little town was under threat from dangerous criminals with a history of violence. Told them the sheriff's department has been strangely quiet about it, which, by the way, isn't going to look great for your friend Boyd once this airs." A pause, cruel and deliberate. "See you soon, Will. Should be quite a show." The line went dead. Boyd, who'd heard enough of the conversation from Will's tense body language, was already reaching for his radio. "I'll get ahead of this. I'll call the station. Explain." "Explain what?" Will's voice was tight with fury. "That a criminal with connections at Town Hall staged a media ambush before a peaceful group of my brothers even crossed the town line. Nobody's going to believe that story over the one already airing on Channel 4. They reached Main Street just in time to see a news van parked outside the Silver Spoon Diner. A reporter in a sharp blazer already speaking into a camera, her voice carrying just far enough for Will to catch fragments. "Sources say a notorious motorcycle gang is descending on this quiet Montana community within the hour. Residents are being urged to stay indoors as law enforcement scrambles to respond. Ahorita questions remain about why local police have failed to prevent this escalating situation." Will felt something cold and furious settle into his chest. This wasn't just a smear. This was a trap being built in real time, brick by brick, with every word that reporter spoke into that camera, and there was almost nothing he could do to stop it before his brothers arrived. Almost nothing. He caught sight of Mrs. Whitfield across the street, her wrist still in its brace, watching the news crew with a deep frown. He crossed to her quickly. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need your help." "Anything, William. Tell that reporter what actually happened to your wrist. Tell her who did it and why. Tell her the truth before Derek's version becomes the only version anyone hears." The old woman's chin lifted, something fierce and unshakable settling into her weathered face. "It would be my genuine pleasure." She marched across the street with more speed than her 78 years should have allowed, straight into the reporter's line of sight, cane striking the pavement with each determined step. "Excuse me," Mrs. Whitfield said loudly, planting herself directly in front of the camera. "If you're telling a story about danger in this town, you're telling the wrong one." The reporter blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're in the middle of—" "I don't care what you're in the middle of. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I've lived in this town for 51 years, and 3 days ago, a man working for Derek Vaughn broke my wrist right on my own front porch." She held up her braced arm for the camera, voice unwavering. "The only person who's protected this town in the last 2 months is William Carter, and now he's called on some old friends to help him do it properly, because our own sheriff's department has been too frightened to act." The reporter's eyes lit up with the scent of a real story unfolding live, and she pivoted instantly, thrusting the microphone toward Mrs. Whitfield. "You're saying local police failed to respond to an assault?" "I'm saying exactly that," Mrs. Whitfield said, "and I'm saying if a group of grown men on motorcycles arrives to make sure it doesn't happen again, this town ought to be thanking them, not running from them." Will watched the exchange with something like awe. In less than a minute, one 78-year-old woman had cracked open the narrative Derek had spent hours constructing, and the reporter, sensing a much more interesting story than the one she'd arrived to cover, was already turning her attention toward Boyd, microphone extended. "Sheriff, is it true your department has failed to act on reports of extortion in this town?" Boyd hesitated for one agonizing second. Will held his breath. Then something shifted in the sheriff's face, the fear finally losing its grip, replaced by the exhausted relief of a man choosing at last to tell the truth. "Yes," Boyd said, his voice carrying clearly across Main Street. "That's true, and I take responsibility for it. I've been operating under threats made against my family, and I let that fear stop me from doing my job the way I swore to do it. That ends today." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, shock and something like respect crossing several faces at once. "What changed?" the reporter pressed. Boyd looked directly at Will, something like gratitude passing between them. A friend reminded me that being scared doesn't excuse being silent, Boyd said. Derek Vaughn has been terrorizing this town for 2 months while I looked the other way. That's on me, but it stops now. The reporter, sensing the story shifting entirely out of Derek's control, turned back to the camera with barely concealed excitement. This appears to be a rapidly developing situation here in Silver Creek, where local corruption allegations are now colliding with the arrival of an outside motorcycle club. We'll continue following this story as it unfolds. Will's phone buzzed. Unknown number again. He almost didn't answer, but something told him he needed to. "You think you're clever?" Derek's voice hissed, all the earlier smugness gone replaced by real fury. "You think one old woman and one scared cop change anything?" "I think," Will said calmly, "that you overestimated how much control you actually had, Derek. That's the thing about building an empire on fear. The second people stop being afraid, it collapses." "We'll see how afraid this town is," Derek snarled, "when your biker friends show up and something goes wrong." "Because something's going to go wrong, old man. I've made sure of it." The line went dead again, and Will felt a fresh wave of dread crash over him. Derek's threat wasn't empty bravado, it was a promise, and Will had learned the hard way a lifetime ago. That promises like that usually got kept in the worst possible way. He didn't have time to process it before he heard the sound. Distant, low. A rumble building, steadily growing louder with every second, rolling across the mountains like approaching thunder. Main Street went completely silent. Every head turned toward the edge of town, toward the sound that was unmistakable to anyone who'd ever heard it before. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. Will's heart pounded against his ribs, hope and terror colliding violently in his chest. They were here. His brothers were here, riding straight into whatever trap Derek had spent all morning constructing, completely unaware of the danger waiting for them. "Will," Boyd said urgently, already moving toward his cruiser. "Whatever Derek's planning, it's about to happen. We need eyes everywhere right now." "Where are they?" Will demanded, scanning the street, the rooftops, every possible vantage point Derek's people might be using. "There," Mrs. Whitfield said, suddenly pointing her cane toward the roof of the hardware store, where two figures were crouched near the edge, one of them holding something that caught the afternoon light, a camera or worse. Will's blood ran cold. "Get everyone off the street, now." But it was already too late. The sound of engines had grown deafening, and the first motorcycles crested the hill at the edge of town, chrome, flashing in the sunlight. 17 riders moving in tight, disciplined formation that spoke of decades of practice. At the front, unmistakable even after 10 years, rode Marcus Preacher Hayes. Will stepped into the street, heart hammering, watching his oldest friend approach for the first time in a decade, praying with everything he had that whatever Derek had planned wouldn't happen before he could warn them. The motorcycles slowed as they entered town, the roar softening into a low, controlled rumble. 17 riders rolling to a stop in a wide arc, facing Main Street engines, idling like held breath. Preacher swung his leg off his bike and pulled off his helmet, silver hair damp with sweat, eyes locking onto Will across the distance between them, with an intensity that made Will's throat close up completely. For a moment, neither man moved. 10 years compressed into a single suspended breath. Then Preacher started walking, and Will met him halfway, and the two men who had once carried each other through the worst days of their lives stood face to face on a small-town Main Street, with a news camera rolling and unseen figures watching from a rooftop with intentions nobody yet understood. "Will," Preacher said, voice thick. "Preacher." Will's own voice broke on the single word. Preacher pulled him into a crushing embrace, and Will felt 10 years of grief and guilt and isolation crack open all at once, his shoulders shaking as he gripped his old friend like a man holding on to solid ground after a decade adrift at sea. "I'm sorry," Will whispered against Preacher's shoulder. "I'm so sorry I disappeared." "You're here now," Preacher said, gripping him tighter. "That's what matters." They pulled apart, and Will's eyes swept the gathered riders behind Preacher faces. He remembered faces that had aged, faces belonging to men who had dropped everything on a moment's notice, because a brother had finally called for help after 10 years of silence. Hollis, Big Mike, a dozen others whose names came flooding back to him in a rush of memory and emotion. "We need to talk," Will said urgently, the moment of reunion giving way immediately to the danger still surrounding them. "Right now." There's a camera crew, there's men on that rooftop, and Derek Vaughn has spent the entire morning trying to frame this exact moment as some kind of invasion. Preacher's expression sharpened instantly, the warmth of reunion replaced by the tactical focus Will remembered from 100 dangerous situations. Talk fast. Will explained everything in rapid, clipped sentences. Derek's threats, the media setup, the figures on the rooftop, the corruption reaching into town hall. Preacher listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each new detail, and by the time Will finished, something cold and dangerous had settled into the older man's eyes. So he wants a show, Preacher said quietly. He wants us to look like the villains. Then we don't give him one. Preacher turned to his gathered brothers, raising his voice just enough to carry. Everybody hears this. We came here for one reason, to stand behind a brother who needed us. We are not here to start trouble. Whatever happens today, whatever gets thrown at us, we hold discipline. You understand me? A chorus of firm agreement rippled through the group. 17 men who had ridden 200 miles on a moment's notice, now standing in perfect controlled unity in the middle of a town that had been braced to fear them. The reporter, sensing an even bigger story unfolding, pushed forward with her microphone, cameraman scrambling to keep up. Sir, can I ask, why did you and your club travel here today? Preacher turned to face her directly, calm and unshaken. A brother of ours has lived in this town for 10 years, keeping his head down, helping this community however he could. 2 weeks ago, a local gang started terrorizing business owners, extorting money through threats and violence. 3 days ago, they broke an elderly woman's wrist. He called us because the people responsible for protecting this town had been intimidated into silence. Preacher's eyes were steady, unflinching. We're not here to cause trouble. We're here because trouble already found this town, and somebody needs to stand against it. The reporter turned back to her camera, practically vibrating with excitement at the story unfolding live. You heard it here first. What began as reports of a dangerous motorcycle gang descending on Silver Creek is revealing itself to be something far more complicated, involving allegations of local corruption and a gunshot cracked through the air. Screams erupted across Main Street as everyone dove for cover, the reporter's cameraman dropping his equipment and scrambling behind the news van. Will's soldier instincts took over instantly, grabbing Preacher and pulling him down behind a parked truck, his eyes snapping immediately toward the rooftop where he'd spotted movement earlier. Everyone down, Boyd shouted, weapon already drawn, sweeping the street for the source. Will's heart hammered as he scanned the chaos, and then he saw it. One of the figures on the hardware store roof, not holding a camera at all, but a rifle already lowering it out of sight after firing what appeared to be a single warning shot into the air. They're trying to make it look like we started shooting. Will realized, horror dawning in his chest. Get everyone's hands visible. Now, nobody reaches for anything. Weapons down! Preacher bellowed to his brothers, his voice cutting through the panic with absolute authority. Hands where everyone can see them. Nobody moves unless I say so. 17 bikers immediately raised their empty hands, standing perfectly still amid the chaos. And Will felt a fierce surge of pride, even in the middle of the danger, his brothers disciplined and controlled, refusing to give Derek the reaction he so desperately needed, captured on camera. Boyd was already moving toward the hardware store, weapon raised, shouting commands. Sheriff's Department, come down from that roof with your hands visible now. A tense, agonizing silence stretched across Main Street. Then slowly a figure emerged at the edge of the hardware store roof. Hands raised, rifle nowhere in sight. He'd clearly ditched it the second Boyd's authority became clear. That's him, Mrs. Whitfield said, suddenly emerging cautiously from behind a mailbox, pointing with her cane. That's the same man who threw the gas can in Will's garage. Derek's people. Boyd's face hardened. Get down here, right now. The man complied, scrambling down a fire escape, and the moment his feet hit the pavement, Boyd had him in cuffs, reading him his rights with a fierce, righteous anger that had been building for 2 months of forced silence. You fired that shot to frame my friends, Boyd said, voice shaking with barely controlled fury. You wanted footage of an exchange of gunfire so Derek could sell his story to every news outlet in the state. The man said nothing, jaw-clenched eyes darting toward where Derek Vaughn had suddenly appeared at the edge of the crowd, his earlier confidence visibly cracking as he watched his carefully constructed plan collapse in real time. Derek, Will called out, stepping forward, every eye on Main Street turning toward him. You just had one of your men fire a weapon in the middle of a crowded street to frame a group of unarmed men. That's not going to play well for your investment opportunities, is it? Derek's face contorted with fury and something close to panic. You think this changes anything, old man? You think one failed setup means I lose? I've got more resources than you can possibly imagine. Then use them, Preacher said, stepping up beside Will, 17 bikers falling into a loose formation behind him, unshaken and unified. Because right now in front of a news camera, in front of this entire town, you just proved exactly what kind of man you are. And no amount of money you're hiding behind is going to erase that. The reporter who had cautiously emerged from behind the news van with her cameraman was already speaking urgently into her microphone, capturing every second of Derek's unraveling composure for a broadcast that was about to reach far beyond Silver Creek's borders. Derek's eyes swept the crowd. Will Preacher, the disciplined line of bikers, Boyd standing tall with real authority for the first time in months, Mrs. Whitfield, with her chin lifted defiantly, dozens of townspeople who had gathered to watch their fear visibly shifting into something else entirely. Something like hope. This isn't over, Derek said, backing away, his voice losing all its earlier confidence. This isn't even close to over. He turned and disappeared into the crowd, his men scrambling to follow, leaving behind a main street filled with stunned silence and the slow dawning realization that something fundamental had just shifted in Silver Creek. Will turned to Preacher, exhaling a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 2 weeks straight. That was too close, he said quietly. That was exactly what we came here for, Preacher replied, gripping Will's shoulder firmly. Brother, I told you, the promise doesn't go quiet. Not for 10 years, not for anything. Around them, the other bikers were beginning to relax slightly, though their eyes remained sharp, scanning the crowd and rooftops for any further threat. Big Mike approached a mountain of a man with a gray beard and kind eyes that hadn't changed in the decades since Will had last seen him. Good to see you, old friend, Big Mike said, pulling Will into a brief, powerful hug. Wish it was under better circumstances. Me too, Will admitted, but I'm grateful you came. Wouldn't have missed it, Big Mike said. None of us would. Boyd approached the group, having secured the man from the rooftop in the back of his cruiser, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and something like relief. That's attempted assault, reckless endangerment, and I'm betting once we get him talking, a lot more charges connecting straight back to Derek Vaughn. Will he talk? Will asked. Scared men usually do. Boyd said once they realize the person they're protecting isn't as powerful as they thought. The reporter approached cautiously. Microphone still extended, her earlier nervousness replaced by focused professional determination. Mr. Carter, can you tell our viewers what's really happening in Silver Creek? Will hesitated, glancing at Preacher, who gave a small nod of encouragement. This was the moment Will realized the chance to take Derek's narrative and burn it to the ground with the truth instead. My name is William Carter, he said, stepping fully into frame, his voice steady despite everything that had just happened. I've lived in this town for 10 years, and for the last 2 months, I've watched a young man named Derek Vaughn terrorize business owners, extort money through threats and violence, and use fear to control this entire community. When he threatened to burn down my garage and hurt the people I care about, I called on the only family I had left who could help me stand against that kind of intimidation. Some might say bringing in an outside motorcycle club only escalates tension, the reporter pressed. Some might, Will agreed, but ask the people of this town whether they feel safer today than they did yesterday. Ask Mrs. Whitfield, whose wrist Derek's men broke 3 days ago. Ask Sheriff Boyd, who was threatened into silence for months until today. My brothers didn't come here to create chaos. They came here because chaos was already here and somebody needed the courage to stand against it. The reporter turned back to her camera, and Will could see in her expression that the story she was about to deliver would be nothing like the one Derek had orchestrated that morning. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, murmurs of shock and gratitude rippling through Main Street, Emily suddenly appeared, pushing through the remaining onlookers with Cooper held tight against her hip, her face pale with fear. Well, I heard gunfire on the radio. She stopped short, taking in the scene. The disciplined line of bikers, Boyd's cruiser with a suspect in the backseat, Will, standing safe and unharmed in the middle of it all. Relief flooded across her face. Oh, thank God. We're okay, Will said, moving to meet her. Everyone's okay. Emily's eyes moved past him to Preacher's, taking in the older biker's weathered face, the genuine warmth radiating from him despite everything that had just happened. You must be Preacher. And you must be the woman Will mentioned on the phone, Preacher said, a small smile breaking through his earlier grimness. Said you were the only reason he hadn't completely forgotten how to be human these last 10 years. Emily's cheeks flushed slightly, but her attention quickly shifted back to the seriousness of the moment. Derek's not going to just walk away from this, not after what just happened on camera. No, Will agreed grimly. He's not, which means this isn't over. This is just the part where he stops playing games and starts fighting for real. Preacher's expression hardened with resolve. Then we're staying. All of us. Until this is finished properly. Will felt a fresh wave of gratitude wash over him, mixed with the sobering knowledge that Derek Vaughn, desperate, humiliated, and backed by resources they still didn't fully understand, was about to become far more dangerous than he'd been even an hour ago. As the sun began sinking lower over the mountains surrounding Silver Creek, casting long shadows across a main street that had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. Will Carter stood among the brothers he'd spent 10 years running from, finally understanding that the family he'd tried so hard to leave behind had been the one thing capable of saving the new life he'd built. But somewhere across town, in a house paid for with money that had never quite made sense, Derek Vaughn sat across from the man who had been guiding him from the shadows all along. His earlier confidence completely shattered, replaced by a desperate, dangerous need to salvage what remained of his crumbling plan. They humiliated me, Derek snarled, pacing the length of the room. On camera, in front of the whole town. Yes, the man said calmly, still swirling that same untouched glass of whiskey, his composure unshaken by the chaos that had just unfolded. They did, which means it's time to stop treating this like a business dispute, Derek, and start treating it like what it actually is. Which is, the man's eyes went cold, calculating utterly without mercy. A war, he said quietly, and wars require sacrifices most people aren't prepared to make. The man's words hung in the air of that dimly lit room like a held breath. Derek stared at him, some of the fury draining out of his face and being replaced by something closer to fear. What kind of sacrifices? Derek asked. The kind you're not currently equipped to understand, the man said, finally taking a sip of his whiskey. Sit down, Derek. You're making me nervous, and nervous men make mistakes. Derek sat though his leg bounced restlessly against the floor, his mind still replaying the humiliation of Main Street, the cameras, the bikers standing unshaken. Will Carter's calm, unbroken voice cutting through everything Derek had built. I need you to understand something about power. The man continued, setting his glass down with deliberate precision. It was never about intimidating shop owners for $500 a week. That was always just cover, a distraction to keep this town looking the other way, while the real business happened underneath it. What real business? The man smiled cold and thin. Land, Derek. This whole valley is sitting on a mining survey that says there's more value under Silver Creek than this entire town has made in the last 50 years combined. Your father knew that. It's why he took those construction contracts, why he cultivated Ashford, why he built the foundation you've been standing on this whole time without ever understanding what it was actually holding up. Derek's mouth went dry. My father never told me any of this. Your father died before he could, the man said simply, which left me to finish what he started, using the only leverage available, his son and his son's ambition to prove himself. The full weight of it settled over Derek, slowly sickly. He wasn't the architect of anything. He was a tool. He always had been. Ashford, Derek said quietly. He's part of this. Ashford's been part of this for 15 years. Every permit, every zoning exception, every look the other way, it's all been building toward a moment where this valley gets sold out from under 1,100 people who have no idea what's coming. The man leaned forward. And now your little extortion scheme and your failure to control one stubborn mechanic has put a spotlight exactly where we didn't want one. So what do? We adjust the plan, the man said. We stop trying to scare Will Carter into submission. We destroy him instead. Legally, publicly. So thoroughly that nobody in that town ever trusts a word he says again, and so completely that his biker friends have no choice but to leave before they can dig any deeper into things that don't concern them. Derek swallowed hard. How? The man's smile widened, and it was the smile of a man who had done this before many times in many towns just like Silver Creek. Leave that to me, he said. You just make sure Ashford is ready to move fast." 2 days after the confrontation on Main Street, Will Carter received a certified letter that would change the entire shape of the fight. He was in the garage when it arrived, Preacher beside him going through inventory on supplies. The club had brought extra tools, extra hands, extra eyes, watching the town in careful rotating shifts that had already begun paying off, catching two more of Derek's men trying to vandalize the Henderson's bakery the previous night before they could do any real damage. The postal carrier, a nervous young man named Kyle, who delivered mail on this route for 3 years, handed Will the envelope with visible reluctance. "Sorry, Mr. Carter," Kyle said. "Just doing my job." Will opened it, standing right there in the doorway, and Preacher watched his old friend's face go pale, then hard, then something close to devastated. "What is it?" Preacher asked. Will handed him the letter without a word. Preacher scanned it quickly, his jaw tightening with every line. "This is insane," Preacher said. "They're accusing you of what?" "Fraud," Will said, his voice hollow. "Insurance fraud. Says here I filed a false damage claim on the garage 2 years ago, padded the repair costs, collected money I wasn't entitled to." He shook his head slowly. "I never filed any insurance claim 2 years ago. My garage never even had damage 2 years ago." "Someone's fabricating a paper trail." "Someone with access to insurance records," Will said grimly. "Someone with the same kind of reach that got a sheriff's daughter's school schedule that made evidence disappear in 3 separate cases against Derek." He looked up at Preacher, exhaustion evident in every line of his weathered face. "This is Ashford. Has to be. Building a case designed to discredit me before I can ever use what Emily found against him." The letter demanded Will appear before a county fraud investigator within 1 week, warning that failure to comply or any attempt to leave the jurisdiction would result in an immediate warrant for his arrest. "They're trying to tie you up," Preacher said. "Keep you fighting a legal battle so you can't focus on the real fight." "It's working," Will admitted. That afternoon, Emily arrived at the garage to find Will hunched over his kitchen table, moved temporarily into the garage office, surrounded by old receipts and invoices, trying desperately to reconstruct records from 2 years ago that he'd never needed to keep because the claim itself had never existed. "Well, what's going on?" He handed her the letter silently, and she read it with growing horror, her hands beginning to shake by the time she finished. "This is fake," she said. "This has to be fake." "Doesn't matter if it's fake," Will said wearily. "It exists on paper now. Somewhere in some insurance database, there's a claim with my name on it that never should exist, and proving a negative, proving something never happened, is a hell of a lot harder than you'd think." "We have the county records," Emily said suddenly. "The connection between Ashford and Derek's father. We show that we expose the motive, and we hand them exactly what they want." Will interrupted gently. "Emily, if we go public with unverified corruption allegations against a sitting councilman, while I'm simultaneously under investigation for fraud, who do you think the town believes, a councilman with 15 years of public service, or a mechanic with a biker gang and a fraud charge hanging over his head?" Emily sank into the chair across from him, the weight of the trap becoming horribly clear. "So we're stuck. For now." Preacher appeared in the doorway, having overheard enough of the conversation to piece together the situation. "Will you need a lawyer? A real one, not some county public defender who's going to fold the second Ashford's people apply pressure." "I don't have that kind of money, Preacher." "You don't need to," Preacher said. "I know someone. Owes me a favor from a long time back. Good lawyer, sharp, doesn't scare easy. I'll make the call tonight." Will looked at his old friend with something like disbelief. "You do that after everything?" "Will," Preacher's voice softened, some of the old warmth breaking through the tension of the last few days. "I told you already, this isn't a favor. This is what family does. Now stop thanking me and let me make the call." That evening, while Preacher worked the phones and Emily continued digging through county records for anything that might help disprove the fraudulent claim, Sheriff Boyd arrived at the garage with news that made the whole situation infinitely more complicated. "They arrested Jesse," Boyd said, referring to the man who'd fired the warning shot on Main Street. "But I've got a problem. The district attorney's office just informed me they're declining to prosecute." "What?" Will stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. "He fired a weapon in a crowded street." "I know what he did," Boyd said, frustration evident in his voice. "But the DA is citing insufficient evidence, questioning the chain of custody on the weapon, suddenly finding all kinds of procedural problems that weren't problems 2 days ago." Ashford, Will said again, the name feeling like a curse in his mouth. I can't prove that, Boyd admitted, but I don't believe in coincidences anymore, not after everything I've watched happen in this town over the last 2 months. So Jesse walks free, Preacher said, his voice dangerous and low. And meanwhile, Will's facing fraud charges for something that never happened. There's more, Boyd said, and something in his tone made everyone in the room go still. Word's already spreading around town, carefully, quietly, but spreading. That Will's under investigation, that maybe he's not the honest mechanic everyone thought he was, that maybe this whole situation with Derek was manufactured by Will himself to cover for financial troubles. That's insane, Emily said, standing up. Anyone who knows Will knows that's insane. Doesn't matter if it's insane, Will said quietly, echoing his own words from earlier that day. It just has to be believable enough to make people doubt. And doubt is all Ashford needs to keep this town paralyzed, while whatever's really happening underneath all this continues without interference. The room fell into heavy silence, the weight of the coordinated attack settling over everyone present. Then Mrs. Whitfield's voice broke through, sharp and unexpected, from the doorway where she'd apparently been standing long enough to hear most of the conversation. Well, she said, planting her cane firmly on the concrete floor, then it's a good thing this town has more backbone than Councilman Ashford is giving it credit for. Everyone turned to look at her. I've lived in this town 51 years, she continued. I watched William Carter fix cars for free for widows who couldn't afford it. I watched him remember every child's birthday, every anniversary, every small kindness a person could need without ever asking for anything in return. I don't need a fraud investigation to tell me who this man is. And I suspect if you ask around properly, a great many people in Silver Creek feel exactly the same way. Will felt something tighten in his throat. Gratitude and exhaustion mixing together into something almost overwhelming. She's right, Emily said, standing straighter. Well, you've spent 10 years building trust in this town, one small act at a time. That doesn't disappear because of one fabricated letter. Let us help you fight this the right way, not just legally, but publicly. Let the town see the truth for themselves. Preacher nodded slowly, a plan already forming behind his weathered eyes. She's onto something. Ashford's whole strategy depends on doubt spreading quietly in whispers and rumors nobody can quite pin down. What happens if we make it loud instead? What happens if we make Will's character the thing everybody's talking about instead of some fraud claim buried in paperwork? How, Will asked. Preacher's smile was slow, calculated, the expression of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to fight battles that couldn't be won with fists alone. We hold a town meeting, he said, right out in the open. Let people say what they know about you. Let the truth drown out the doubt before Ashford's paperwork ever gets the chance to. The following evening, word spread through Silver Creek that a community meeting was being held at the church, organized not by the town council, but by ordinary residents who had grown tired of watching fear control their small town. The turnout exceeded anyone's expectations. By the time Will arrived with Preacher Emily and several of the visiting bikers, the church was packed beyond capacity, people standing along the walls spilling out into the entryway, faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and quiet determination. Sheriff Boyd stood near the front, having agreed to moderate, despite the personal risk it carried for him professionally. Mrs. Whitfield sat in the front row, chin-lifted cane resting against her knee like a scepter. I know most of you have heard rumors this week, Boyd began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. About Will Carter, about an investigation. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to give people a chance to speak the truth as they know it, so this town can decide for itself what's real. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Derek Vaughn was noticeably absent, though Will spotted two of his men lingering near the back entrance, clearly there to report back on everything said. Pete Alvarez, the hardware store owner, stood first. Will Carter fixed my daughter's car for free when her transmission blew out and she couldn't afford repairs while she was working 2 jobs to pay for nursing school. Never asked for a dime, never mentioned it again. A woman near the middle of the room, someone Will barely recognize, stood next. 15 years ago, before most of you knew him well, my husband was dying of cancer. Will drove me to the hospital every single day for 3 months because I didn't trust myself to drive after the appointments. Never once complained, never once asked to be paid. One by one, residents of Silver Creek stood and spoke stories. Will had long forgotten kindnesses. He'd never thought twice about small acts of decency accumulated over 10 quiet years that had built something far more powerful than Ashford's fabricated paperwork could ever hope to destroy. Will sat through it with tears he made no effort to hide, whelmed by the sheer volume of goodness reflected back at him from a town he had only ever tried to serve quietly without ever expecting recognition. When the stories finally slowed, Preacher stood his weathered face solemn as he addressed the crowd. "I've known William Carter for over 20 years," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of hard-won respect. "I've seen him carry wounded brothers out of danger at his own risk. I've seen him sit beside a grieving father for 6 months straight, saying nothing, just being present, because that's what real strength looks like. This man does not have a dishonest bone in his body. Whatever paperwork someone's manufactured against him, I promise you, it's a lie built by people far more dishonest than Will Carter has ever been in his entire life." The room erupted into applause, and Will felt Emily's hand find his beneath the pew, squeezing tight, her eyes shining with pride and something deeper that neither of them had quite named yet. Then from the back of the church, a new voice cut through the warmth of the moment. "How touching." Everyone turned. Derek Vaughn stood in the doorway, flanked by two men, his earlier composure replaced by something colder, more desperate. "All these lovely stories," Derek continued, walking slowly down the center aisle, "but none of them explain the insurance fraud investigation currently underway against your beloved Will Carter. Do they?" "Get out, Derek," Boyd said firmly. "This is a public meeting. Sheriff, I have every right to be here." Derek's eyes swept the crowd with cold calculation. "You people want to talk about character. Let's talk about the character of a man who called in an outlaw motorcycle gang to threaten this town's peace, who's currently under investigation for financial fraud, who's been hiding his violent past from every single person in this room for a decade." "That's not what happened," Emily said, standing up, her voice shaking with fury but unwavering. "You're the one, man, who's been extorting this town for months. You're the one who broke Mrs. Whitfield's wrist. You're the one who staged a gunshot on Main Street to frame innocent people." "Allegations," Derek said smoothly. "Nothing more. Meanwhile, there's an official investigation underway against Mr. Carter that none of you seem interested in discussing honestly." The room's energy shifted, uncertainty creeping back in, despite everything that had just been shared. Will felt it happening in real time, watched faces that had been full of warmth and support just moments ago, beginning to flicker with doubt again. He stood up slowly. "You want to talk about that investigation, Derek?" Will said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Fine, let's talk about it right here, right now, in front of everyone." Derek's smirk faltered slightly. "There's nothing to discuss. The facts speak for themselves." "The facts," Will said, stepping into the center aisle to face him directly, "are that I have never in my life filed an insurance claim on this garage. Not 2 years ago, not ever. If that claim exists in some database somewhere, it was manufactured by someone with the power and connections to fabricate financial records, the same someone who's been protecting you from prosecution this entire time, the same someone who threatened Sheriff Boyd's 9-year-old daughter to keep this town paralyzed with fear." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Boyd, standing at the front, nodded grimly, confirming Will's words with his silence. "That's a serious accusation," Derek said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "It's the truth," Will said, "and I think everyone in this room deserves to know exactly who's really running this operation, Derek. Because it's not you. You're just a scared kid who inherited a mess he doesn't understand, being used by someone far more dangerous than you'll ever be." Derek's face contorted with rage and something like genuine fear. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Will held his gaze steady. "Councilman Gerald Ashford, 15 years of construction contracts with your father's company. 15 years of permits and approvals that never should have gone through. Emily found the records, Derek. We know exactly how deep this goes, and we know you're not the one calling the shots." The church went completely silent, every eye now fixed on Derek, whose composure had shattered entirely, replaced by raw panic. "You have no proof of any of that," Derek said, backing toward the door. "We have public records," Emily said, standing firm. 15 years of them, and we're prepared to share every single document with this town, with the state attorney general's office, with anyone willing to listen. Derek's eyes darted around the room, taking in the sea of faces, no longer looking at him with fear, but with something far more dangerous to his position, dawning understanding and the beginnings of real anger. This isn't over, Derek said, his voice cracking slightly as he retreated toward the exit. None of this is over. He fled, his two men scrambling after him, leaving behind a church full of stunned silence that slowly, gradually erupted into a wave of urgent, overlapping conversation. Preacher clapped a firm hand on Will's shoulder. That took guts, brother. I'm tired of hiding, Will said quietly. Tired of letting fear control this town, control my own life. If exposing Ashford means losing everything I've built here, so be it. At least it'll be the truth. Boyd approached, his expression grim but resolute. Well, that accusation against Ashford, a sitting councilman, that's going to bring serious heat down on all of us. You understand that, right? I understand, Will said, but it's already heat we've been living under for months, Boyd. The only difference now is people finally know where it's actually coming from. 3 days later, the fallout began in earnest. The local news station that had covered the Main Street confrontation ran a follow-up story, this time focusing entirely on the corruption allegations against Councilman Ashford, backed by copies of the public records Emily had gathered. The story spread fast, picked up by a regional outlet, then a state one, each new report adding pressure that Ashford clearly hadn't anticipated when he'd started this whole scheme. Will's fraud investigation, meanwhile, hit an unexpected snag. Preacher's lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Castellano, who arrived in Silver Creek within 48 hours of Preacher's call, discovered within days that the insurance claim in question had been filed electronically from an IP address registered to a law office in the state capital, an office with documented ties to a shell company that, after considerable digging, traced back to land development interests connected to a mining conglomerate. This wasn't Ashford acting alone, Diane told Will and Preacher, spreading printouts across the garage's makeshift office table. This is bigger than a corrupt councilman padding contracts for a construction company. Someone with serious money and serious legal resources orchestrated this entire fraud claim, and I'd bet everything I own that same someone is the one really pulling Derek Vaughn's strings. Mining interests, Will said slowly, remembering Derek's earlier comments about resources he couldn't possibly imagine. This whole thing was never about protection money. It was cover, Diane confirmed, a distraction while someone quietly positioned themselves to acquire land rights across this entire valley. The revelation sent a fresh wave of urgency through everyone involved. If the stakes were this much larger than anyone had initially realized, Derek Vaughn suddenly seemed less like the primary threat and more like a small, desperate piece in a much larger, much more dangerous game. That night, as Will sat alone in the garage long after everyone else had gone home trying to process the magnitude of what they'd uncovered, Emily arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee and a look of quiet determination. You should be resting, Will said. So should you. She handed him a cup, sitting down across from him. Well, I keep thinking about something Diane said. If this is about mining rights across the whole valley, that means it's not just Silver Creek's businesses at risk. It's everyone's land, everyone's homes. I know. Which means this fight isn't just about you anymore. It's about the whole town's future. Will nodded slowly, the weight of that responsibility settling heavily onto his shoulders. I never wanted this, Emily. I came to Silver Creek to disappear, to live a quiet life where I couldn't hurt anyone else the way I hurt Tommy. And now I'm standing in the middle of the biggest fight this town has ever seen. Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person to be standing here, Emily said gently. You've spent 10 years learning how to carry guilt, how to carry weight most people would collapse under. Maybe that's exactly the kind of strength this town needs right now. Will looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his chest, not just gratitude, but something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in over a decade. When this is over, he said quietly, whatever's left of my life afterward, I don't want to spend it hiding anymore, Emily. I don't want to spend it alone. Emily's breath caught, understanding exactly what he was saying without him needing to say it more directly. Will, I'm not asking for anything right now, he said quickly. I just needed you to know that. Whatever happens with Derek, with Ashford, with all of this, I want to still be standing here in this town with you and Cooper when it's finally over. Emily reached across the table and took his weathered hand in both of hers, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You will be, she said firmly. We're going to make sure of it. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the garage's back door slamming open. Preacher rushing in with his phone still pressed to his ear, his face etched with urgent concern. Will, we've got a problem. Will stood immediately, every instinct sharpening. What kind of problem? That was Boyd. Preacher's expression was grim. Ashford's filed an emergency injunction claiming your continued presence with an active fraud investigation combined with known criminal associates, meaning us represents an immediate threat to public safety. He's petitioning a judge for an emergency order, forcing you out of Silver Creek within 72 hours pending resolution of the fraud case. They can't do that, Emily said, standing up sharply. That's insane. It's exactly what desperate men do when they're losing control of a narrative. Diane said, having followed Preacher in from the parking lot where she'd apparently been on a separate call. And I'll be honest with both of you, depending on which judge gets assigned, this could actually work. Small counties connected officials, it happens more often than it should. Will felt something cold settle into his stomach. After everything, the town meeting, the outpouring of support, the mounting evidence against Ashford, it was still possible that raw legal maneuvering could force him out of the only home he'd built for himself in a decade, could separate him from Emily, from Cooper, from a town that had finally started to see him for who he really was. When's the hearing? Will asked. Tomorrow morning, Diane said. Ashford's pushing for emergency speed, hoping to catch us off guard before we can properly prepare a defense. Then we don't sleep tonight, Preacher said firmly. We prepare. All of us. Diane, what do you need? Diane was already pulling out a legal pad, her expression sharpening into fierce focus. I need every piece of evidence Emily's gathered. I need character witnesses ready to testify on short notice. And I need someone to explain to me exactly how deep this mining conglomerate connection goes. Because if I can bring that into tomorrow's hearing, it changes the entire conversation from dangerous biker associate to whistleblower being silenced by corrupt local officials protecting a massive land grab. Will looked around the garage at the faces gathered there. Preacher Diane, Emily, soon joined by Boyd and several other bikers who'd heard the news and arrived within minutes ready to help however they could, and felt something powerful swell in his chest despite the danger closing in around them. 10 years ago, he'd walked away from everyone who cared about him because he believed isolation was the only way to keep the people around him safe. Tonight, surrounded by old brothers and new family alike, all of them working desperately through the night to protect not just him, but the entire town he'd come to love, Will finally understood how wrong he'd been. Let's get to work, he said, sitting back down at the table, ready to fight for everything that mattered most. Outside, the night stretched dark and quiet over Silver Creek. But inside, the garage lights burned late into the morning hours as old friends and new allies fought together to save not just one man's freedom, but the future of an entire town that had finally found the courage to stand against the shadows trying to consume it. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock, and by 8:30, the small county courthouse in Silver Creek had no available seats left inside, with dozens more residents crowded onto the front steps. Despite the cold morning air, waiting for news of a decision none of them could control, but all of them desperately cared about. Will sat beside Diane Castellano at the defense table, his weathered hands folded tightly in his lap. Preacher and Emily seated directly behind him in the gallery, close enough that he could feel their presence, even without turning around. Remember, Diane said quietly, let me do the talking unless I specifically ask you a question. Emotional outbursts, even righteous ones, only give them ammunition. I understand. Do you? She studied him carefully. Because I've read your file, Will. I know what kind of man walks away from everything he loves for 10 years out of guilt. That kind of man sometimes has trouble staying quiet when he feels responsible for other people's suffering. Will managed a small, tired smile. I'll behave, Diane. Judge Harmon entered, the stern woman in her 60s, whose reputation, according to Diane's late-night research, suggested she ran a tight courtroom and had little patience for theatrics from either side. We're here on an emergency petition filed by Councilman Gerald Ashford. Judge Harmon began requesting an immediate order requiring William Carter to vacate Silver Creek pending resolution of an active fraud investigation, citing public safety concerns related to associations with an outlaw motorcycle organization. Counsel for the petitioner, you may proceed. Ashford's lawyer stood, a slick, expensive-looking man Will didn't recognize, clearly flown in from somewhere far more sophisticated than Silver Creek's usual legal circles. Your Honor, my client's concerns are straightforward. Mr. Carter is currently under active investigation for insurance fraud. In the days since that investigation began, he has summoned a group of armed, dangerous individuals to this town, individuals whose mere presence has already resulted in a public discharge of a firearm on Main Street. The town's safety demands immediate action. Objection to the characterization, Diane said, rising smoothly. The firearm discharge referenced was fired by an employee of Derek Vaughn, a man with documented ties to Councilman Ashford's late business partner, not by anyone associated with my client. That connection remains unproven, Ashford's lawyer countered. It's proven in the 15 years of public construction records we've already submitted to this court. Diane shot back, sliding a thick folder across the table. Records showing Councilman Ashford personally approved contracts, permits, and zoning exceptions for Harold Vaughn's construction company going back a decade and a half, contracts that conveniently align with a mining survey conducted 18 months ago identifying significant mineral deposits beneath this valley. A murmur rippled through the packed gallery. Judge Harmon's expression sharpened with interest. Counsel, the judge said, addressing Diane directly, you're alleging a much larger conspiracy than what's currently before this court. I'm alleging exactly what the evidence shows, Your Honor, Diane said firmly, that this emergency petition is not about public safety. It's a coordinated effort to remove my client from this town before he can expose a scheme that stands to profit certain individuals at the expense of every resident of Silver Creek. Ashford's lawyer stood again, visibly rattled. Your Honor, these are baseless accusations designed to distract from the actual matter at hand, which is my client's active fraud investigation. Then let's discuss the fraud investigation directly, Diane said, pulling a new document from her folder. Your Honor, I have here a forensic analysis of the electronic filing that initiated this investigation. The insurance claim in question was submitted from an IP address registered not to Mr. Carter, not to anyone in Silver Creek, but to a law firm in the state capital with documented financial ties to Meridian Resource Partners, a mining conglomerate that filed for mineral extraction rights in this county exactly 11 days after that fraudulent claim was submitted. The courtroom erupted into stunned murmuring. Judge Harmon banged her gavel once, restoring order, but her expression had shifted entirely, sharp interest replacing procedural neutrality. That's a serious allegation, counselor, the judge said. You're suggesting Mr. Carter was framed to clear the way for a mining acquisition. I'm suggesting exactly that. Your Honor, and I have the documentation to support it. Diane's voice rang clear and confident through the silent courtroom. My client came to this town 10 years ago seeking a quiet life. He built trust one act of kindness at a time for a decade. When a young man began extorting local businesses 2 months ago, my client did what any decent citizen would do. He sought help. The response from certain individuals in positions of power has been to fabricate criminal charges, threaten a sheriff's family into silence, and now attempt to forcibly remove him from his home before the truth can fully surface. Ashford's lawyer looked increasingly desperate, glancing toward the back of the courtroom, where Councilman Ashford himself sat, his face pale, sweat beading at his temples despite the cool morning air. Your Honor, the lawyer tried. Regardless of these unproven allegations, the emergency safety concern remains. Enough, Judge Harmon interrupted, her patience visibly thinning. Mr. Ashford, do you have any response to these specific allegations regarding the fraudulent insurance filing and its connection to Meridian Resource Partners? All eyes turned to Ashford, who rose slowly from his seat in the gallery, his composure cracking visibly under the weight of dozens of watching townspeople. Your Honor, I object to being questioned directly in this. You filed this petition, Mr. Ashford, the judge said sharply. You brought this matter before my court claiming public safety concerns. I find it curious that you're suddenly reluctant to address direct questions about the underlying circumstances. The silence stretched tense and suffocating, and Will watched Ashford's face cycle through panic calculation and finally something like resignation as he realized there was no clean way out of the corner he'd backed himself into. I have nothing further to say without my own counsel present. Ashford finally managed, his voice barely audible. Then perhaps, Judge Harmon said coldly, you should have considered that before filing an emergency petition built on shaky ground. She turned back to the courtroom at large. This court is not prepared to grant an emergency order removing Mr. Carter from Silver Creek based on the evidence presented today. Furthermore, given the serious allegations of evidence tampering and potential corruption raised by defense counsel, I am ordering an immediate independent investigation into the circumstances surrounding this fraud claim to be conducted by the State Attorney General's office rather than county authorities, given the apparent conflicts of interest at play. The courtroom exploded into noise, gasps, murmurs, someone near the back beginning to applaud before being quickly shushed. Will felt Preacher's hand clap firmly onto his shoulder from behind, and when he turned, Emily's eyes were bright with tears and fierce, triumphant relief. "This isn't over," Diane said quietly, leaning toward Will, even as the celebration bubbled around them. "But it's the biggest win we could have hoped for today. State investigators mean Ashford can't bury evidence the way he's been doing at the county level." Ashford was already moving toward the exit, his lawyer trailing behind him, both men's faces etched with the particular panic of powerful people watching their carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. Will stood his legs unsteady with relief and turned to find Emily already moving toward him, pulling him into an embrace that said everything neither of them had fully found words for the night before. "You're not leaving," she whispered against his shoulder. "You're staying." "I'm staying," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered on the steps erupted into cheers as word spread of the ruling, and Will found himself surrounded by townspeople reaching to shake his hand, to thank him, to express a solidarity that 10 years of quiet kindness had finally earned in full. But even amid the celebration, Will felt Preacher's hand tighten on his shoulder, a warning conveyed through touch alone. "Don't let your guard down yet, brother," Preacher murmured. "Cornered men do desperate things." He was right, though none of them yet understood exactly how desperate Derek Vaughn's next move would be. That evening, as Silver Creek celebrated a victory that felt for the first time in months like genuine hope restored, Derek Vaughn sat alone in his rented house staring at his phone, a single text message displayed on the screen that had arrived 20 minutes earlier and had not stopped his hands from shaking since. "The investigation is closing in. You know what needs to happen. Finish it tonight or I finish you instead." Derek stared at the message for a long time, his mind racing through every version of the future he could imagine, none of them ending well. He thought about his father, about the empire he'd inherited without ever truly understanding its foundations, about the desperate months of trying to prove himself worthy of a legacy that had turned out to be nothing but a cage built by men far more dangerous than he'd ever been. He thought about Will Carter's steady, unshaken voice on Main Street, in the church, in every confrontation between them, a man who had lost everything once and rebuilt himself anyway, who had somehow found more strength and quiet decency than Derek had ever managed to find in fear and intimidation. For the first time since this entire scheme began, Derek Vaughn felt something other than ambition or anger. He felt trapped, and trapped men, Preacher had warned, do desperate things. Derek grabbed his jacket, grabbed the gun he kept in his desk drawer for reasons he'd never fully examined, and walked out into the cold Montana night with a plan forming that terrified even him. Will was closing up the garage well past dark, the celebratory energy of the day's victory still humming pleasantly beneath his exhaustion, when he heard a car pull up outside, not the roar of a motorcycle, not Boyd's familiar cruiser, but something quieter, more deliberate. He stepped outside just as Derek Vaughn emerged from his car, alone, his face pale and haunted in the glow of the single streetlight illuminating the garage entrance. "Derek." Will's instincts sharpened immediately, every muscle in his body going tense. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I shouldn't, but I didn't know where else to go." Will noticed the way Derek's hands trembled, the way his eyes kept darting toward the darkness beyond the streetlight, like he expected something or someone to emerge from it at any moment. "What's going on, Derek?" "They're going to kill me," Derek said, the words tumbling out in a rush of raw panic. "The people backing this whole thing. I failed them today in that courtroom, and I got a message 20 minutes ago telling me to finish this tonight, or they'll finish me instead." Will's blood ran cold. Finish what exactly? Derek's eyes welled with tears, 10 years of inherited ambition and desperate self-preservation, finally cracking completely under the weight of what he was being asked to do. "You," Derek whispered. "They want you gone, Will, permanently. And I don't," his voice broke completely, "I do not know how to be that kind of person. I thought I did. I thought I could handle all of this, prove I was as capable as my father, but I'm not. I'm not that person, and now they're going to kill me for admitting it." Will studied the young man in front of him, no longer the arrogant gang leader who'd threatened his garage weeks earlier, but a terrified 26-year-old realizing far too late how badly he'd been used. "Derek, listen to me very carefully," Will said, his voice steady despite the danger clearly still present. "Whoever sent that message, they're not people you can negotiate with or run from alone. You need protection. real protection. And the only way you get that is by telling the truth completely to people who can actually help you. They'll kill me if I talk. They'll kill you eventually regardless, Will said bluntly. Men like whoever's behind this don't leave loose ends alive once they've served their purpose. Your only real chance is bringing everything into the light before they can silence you first. Derek's hands shook harder, the gun tucked into his waistband, suddenly feeling less like protection and more like evidence of exactly how far he'd already fallen. I have a gun, Derek admitted suddenly, the confession spilling out before he could stop it. They told me to use it on you tonight. I drove here twice already and turned around both times. Will's heart pounded, but his voice remained calm, measured the tone of a man who had once talked frightened soldiers through their worst moments and hadn't fully lost the skill despite 10 years away from that life. Give me the gun, Derek. Derek hesitated, his whole body trembling, and for one agonizing moment, Will genuinely didn't know which way this would break. Then Derek reached slowly into his waistband, pulled out the weapon with shaking hands, and held it out toward Will, tears streaming freely down his face now. I don't want to be this person, Derek whispered. I never wanted to be this person. Will took the gun carefully, immediately unloading it with the practiced efficiency of old training before setting it safely aside on his workbench. Then don't be, Will said quietly. It's not too late, Derek, but you need to make a choice right now tonight about who you're going to become from this point forward. Behind them, the headlights swept across the garage entrance, and both men turned sharply, adrenaline spiking as a familiar car rolled to a stop, and Boyd stepped out, having apparently followed Derek's vehicle after spotting it leaving his rented house. Everything all right here? Boyd called out, his hand resting cautiously near his holster as he took in the scene, Derek's tear-streaked face, the unloaded gun sitting on Will's workbench. Derek's ready to talk, Will said, about everything, about who's really behind all of this. Boyd's expression shifted from caution to sharp focus. Is that true, son? Derek nodded slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand, something like relief beginning to break through the terror. They're going to kill me if I don't kill him tonight. I won't do that. I need protection and I need to tell someone everything I know. Boyd was already reaching for his radio. I'm calling the state investigators assigned to this case. If what you're telling me is real, we need to move fast to get you into protective custody before whoever's threatening you realizes you've flipped. Within an hour, 2 state investigators who had been assigned to the case following that morning's court order arrived at the sheriff's office, and Derek Vaughn began talking, really talking for the first time since this entire scheme had begun, laying out everything he knew about Meridian Resource Partners, about the man who had been guiding him from the shadows, about 15 years of corruption connecting Ashford's approvals to his father's contracts to a mining deal worth more money than Silver Creek's entire tax base combined. Will sat in the sheriff's office lobby through most of it, Emily beside him, Preacher pacing near the door. All of them waiting to learn exactly how deep this conspiracy really went and how close they'd all come to a very different, much darker ending. You did the right thing, Emily said quietly, her hand finding Will's. Taking that gun from him, talking him down instead of just calling it in immediately. He's a scared kid who got in over his head, Will said. I know what that looks like. I've seen it in soldiers half his age making decisions that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the difference between a monster and a man who made terrible choices is just having someone willing to talk them back from the edge. Around midnight, Boyd emerged from the interview room, his expression a complicated mixture of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. State investigators are moving fast, he told the gathered group. Derek's given them names, dates, financial records he'd been keeping as insurance against exactly this kind of betrayal. They're already coordinating with the Attorney General's office for arrest warrants, Ashford, and the man Derek identifies as his primary handler. Someone named Victor Reyes, a fixer who's apparently orchestrated similar land acquisition schemes in at least 2 other small towns over the past decade. Reyes. Will repeated something cold settling in his chest at the surname, though he told himself it was surely coincidence, nothing more. You know him, Boyd asked. No, Will said slowly. Just a name that means something else to me, probably nothing. But the coincidence gnawed at him. Even as the investigation moved forward with startling speed, over the following days, Ashford arrested within 48 hours on charges ranging from bribery to obstruction of justice. Victor Reyes apprehended trying to flee the state. 3 days after that, The full scope of the mining conspiracy finally laid bare for the entire town to see. It was during Reyes' arraignment broadcast on the same local news station that had covered every twist of Silver Creek's ordeal that Will finally understood why that surname had struck him so deeply. He was in the garage working quietly on a transmission, half listening to the small television Preacher had set up in the corner for updates when the courtroom camera panned briefly to Reyes' family, seated in the gallery, his wife visibly devastated, and beside her an older woman whose face Will recognized instantly, despite the decade that had passed. Tommy's mother. Will's wrench clattered to the concrete floor. Emily, who had been sorting invoices nearby, looked up sharply at the sound. "What's wrong?" Will stared at the screen, his whole body gone rigid with shock, memories crashing over him in a violent wave he hadn't prepared for. "Victor Reyes," he said hoarsely. "That's Tommy's older brother." The room went silent. Preacher, who had been half dozing in a chair near the workbench, sat up sharply, his own face draining of color as understanding dawned. "Tommy Reyes," Preacher said slowly. "You're Tommy, the one who died because of my call." Will finished, his voice barely above a whisper. 10 years ago, and now his brother's been orchestrating a conspiracy that led me straight back into this exact kind of danger. Emily crossed the room, quickly taking Will's trembling hands in hers. "Well, that can't be coincidence." "No," Will agreed, his mind racing back through everything that had happened since that first threatening visit from Derek Vaughn. "It's not." The full truth emerged over the following week, pieced together through Reyes' own desperate plea deal testimony as he tried to minimize his sentence by cooperating fully with investigators. Victor Reyes had spent the past decade building a career as a corporate fixer for land acquisition schemes exactly like the one unfolding in Silver Creek. But when Meridian Resource Partners identified this particular valley as a target, and Reyes discovered during initial reconnaissance that the town's most respected resident was none other than William Carter, the man whose tactical decision had gotten his younger brother killed a decade earlier, something in him had shifted from professional opportunism into something far more personal. "He wanted you to suffer," Boyd told Will and Preacher during a private meeting at the sheriff's office, laying out Reyes' own admission from his cooperation agreement. "The land deal was real, the money was real, but once he realized you were living quietly in the exact town he'd targeted, he saw an opportunity for something more than profit. He wanted to destroy everything you'd built. Your reputation, your freedom, maybe even your life as payback for Tommy." Will sat with that revelation for a long moment, the weight of it settling into him with brutal, complicated clarity. "Does he know," Will finally asked, his voice barely steady, "that I've carried Tommy's death every single day for 10 years? That I didn't run from grief. I ran because I couldn't forgive myself." "He knows now," Boyd said quietly. "It's part of his cooperation statement. For what it's worth," the investigator said, he broke down during questioning. Admitted the anger had been eating him alive for a decade too. Admitted part of him always knew it wasn't really your fault, that combat decisions made in seconds don't deserve the same judgment as decisions made with time to think clearly. He just needed somewhere to put 10 years of grief, and revenge felt easier than forgiveness. Will closed his eyes, absorbing that feeling. Something complicated shifted inside his chest, not quite closure, not quite peace, but something adjacent to both a recognition that grief left unexamined could poison even good men into terrible choices. Himself included, all those years he'd spent punishing himself in isolated silence, instead of allowing Brotherhood to help him heal. "I want to see him," Will said suddenly. "Reyes, before sentencing." "Well, I don't think," Preacher started. "I need to," Will said firmly. "Not for him, for me, for Tommy. There's things that need saying that 10 years of silence should have said a long time ago." The visit was arranged 3 days later in a small meeting room at the county detention facility. Victor Reyes led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his face a haunted mirror of grief and shame that Will recognized intimately, having worn a similar expression himself for the better part of a decade. They sat across from each other in heavy silence for a long moment before Will finally spoke. "I think about your brother every single day," Will said quietly, "not as an obligation, not as guilt I'm required to carry, because Tommy mattered, because he was 24 years old and funny and terrified and brave all at once, and I was supposed to bring him home safe, and I didn't." Reyes's jaw trembled, tears already forming. "You told him to go left." "I told him to go left," Will confirmed, his own voice cracking, Because that's what my training said. Because in that moment with the information I had, it was the right call by every measure except the one that mattered most, keeping him alive. I've replayed that decision 10,000 times, Victor. I will replay it for the rest of my life. But I need you to understand something because I think you need to hear it as much as I need to say it. What? Grief doesn't owe anyone revenge, Will said. It doesn't need a target to become meaningful. Tommy's death broke something in both of us, and instead of finding each other, instead of grieving together the way brothers should, we let it turn into something poisonous. You spent 10 years building toward destroying me. I spent 10 years destroying myself slowly through isolation. Neither one of us gave Tommy the honor he actually deserved. Reyes broke down completely, then years of buried grief finally surfacing in full, and Will, despite everything, despite the fraud charges, the threats, the danger this man's scheme had brought to an entire town, found himself reaching across the table to grip Reyes's shaking hand. I forgive you, Will said quietly. Not because what you did was acceptable. It wasn't. People will hold you accountable for that as they should. But I forgive you because carrying more hatred forward doesn't honor Tommy's memory. It just creates more wreckage in a story that's already had enough. Reyes looked up at him, disbelief and gratitude warring across his tear-streaked face. How can you forgive me after everything? Because someone taught me a long time ago, Will said, thinking of Preacher, of every brother who had refused to let him disappear completely even during his darkest years. That family means showing up even when it's hard, even when someone doesn't deserve it, especially then. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Ashford received 12 years for corruption and bribery. Reyes, given his cooperation and genuine remorse, received a reduced sentence of 5 years, with the possibility of earlier release for continued good behavior. Derek Vaughn, having cooperated fully from the very beginning and having never actually followed through on the violence he'd been directed to commit, avoided serious prison time entirely. Instead, receiving probation and mandatory community service work, he began immediately and unexpectedly at Will's garage, learning an honest trade from the very man he'd once threatened to destroy. You didn't have to do this, Derek told Will during his first week of community service. Hands stained with grease for the first time in his privileged life, clearly uncomfortable with the manual labor, but determined to see it through. No, Will agreed, I didn't have to, but everyone deserves a chance to become someone different than the person's circumstances tried to make them. I got that chance, Derek. Seems only fair to extend the same grace. By the time autumn settled fully over Silver Creek, the town had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted just months earlier. The mining conglomerate's acquisition attempt collapsed entirely once the corruption became public, protecting the valley's land rights for generations of residents to come. Sheriff Boyd, having found his courage when it mattered most, won re-election, unopposed, his integrity restored in the eyes of the community he'd once been too frightened to fully protect. And the Hells Angels who had answered Will's call, Preacher Big Mike Hollis and the rest, became an unlikely but permanent fixture of Silver Creek life, several of them ultimately deciding to relocate, entirely drawn by the same quiet beauty and genuine community spirit that had once drawn Will himself a decade earlier, to disappear into these same mountains. On a crisp October evening, the whole town gathered outside Will's garage for a celebration that had become something of a tradition over the past month. A simple cookout, folding tables loaded with food, string lights hung between the garage and the old oak tree beside it. Laughter and conversation carrying warmly through the cooling autumn air. Will stood near the edge of the gathering, watching Cooper chase fireflies with 2 of the younger bikers' grandchildren who had come to visit, watching Mrs. Whitfield holding court with Big Mike about motorcycle maintenance with more enthusiasm than her 78 years should probably allow, watching Preacher and Boyd deep and easy conversation like old friends instead of men who'd met only months earlier under the worst possible circumstances. Emily found him there, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand, offering him one as she settled beside him. You look happy, she observed. I am happy, Will said, and meant it fully, perhaps for the first time in over a decade. I spent 10 years believing peace meant disappearing, believing that protecting the people I loved meant staying far away from them, keeping my past locked in a drawer I never opened. And now, Will looked around at the gathering brothers found again after a decade of separation. A town that had chosen courage over fear. A young man given a second chance instead of destruction, and beside him a woman and a little boy who had somehow become the family he never thought he'd allow himself to have again. Now I understand something Preacher tried to tell me on that phone call months ago, Will said. The promise doesn't go quiet just because you go quiet. Family doesn't disappear with distance or time. It waits patient and unshaken until you're finally ready to let it back in. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, and Will wrapped his arm around her, watching Cooper's delighted laughter carry across the yard as he finally caught a firefly cupped gently between his small hands. Preacher's talking about staying, Emily said, permanently, setting up a satellite chapter here in Silver Creek. I heard, Will said, smiling. Big Mike's already looking at property outside town. How does that make you feel? Will considered the question seriously, feeling the weight of 10 lonely years finally lifting completely from his shoulders. Like maybe I don't have to choose between the family I found in war and the family I found in peace. Like maybe for the first time since Tommy died, I get to have both. Preacher wandered over just as the sun began sinking fully behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that Will had watched alone for 10 quiet years and would never have to watch alone again. Quite a turnout tonight, Preacher observed, settling beside them with a contented sigh, watching the community he'd helped save gathered together in genuine hard-won peace. Quite a town, Will agreed. You know, Preacher said, his voice growing more serious. When you called me that night, 10 years of silence behind us, I honestly didn't know what I was going to find when I got here. Half of me feared you'd become someone I wouldn't recognize anymore. Someone too broken by grief to ever come back from it. And the other half, Preacher smiled, warm and genuine, clapping a firm hand on Will's shoulder. The other half remembered exactly who you were before Tommy, before the war. A man who never stopped believing that kindness mattered even when the whole world gave him every reason to believe otherwise. Looks like that man was still in there the whole time, brother. Just needed the right town, the right people, and the right moment to remember it. Will felt his throat tighten with emotion, looking out at the gathered crowd. A town he had quietly served for a decade without ever expecting recognition, now standing united and unafraid, because he had finally found the courage to let his true self be seen. Thank you, Will said quietly, for not letting me disappear completely. For answering that call after 10 years of silence, no questions asked. That's what brotherhood means, Will, Preacher said simply. It doesn't wait for perfect timing. It doesn't require you to have everything figured out first. It just shows up exactly when you need it most and refuses to let go. As darkness settled fully over Silver Creek, the string lights glowing warm against the autumn evening, the sound of laughter and easy conversation drifting across a community that had faced corruption and fear and had chosen courage instead, Will Carter stood surrounded by everyone who mattered most. Old brothers and new family. A woman who had seen every broken piece of him and chosen to stay anyway. A little boy who had never once doubted that Will was exactly the kind of man worth trusting completely. He thought of Tommy one final time that evening, not with the crushing guilt that had defined the last decade, but with something gentler, something closer to gratitude for the years they'd shared before everything went wrong, and something like peace in knowing that Tommy's memory had ultimately led not to more destruction, but to redemption for everyone touched by that terrible night 10 years ago. The town that once believed Will Carter was nothing more than a harmless old mechanic now understood the fuller truth that beneath his quiet kindness had always lived a warrior's heart, tempered by loss into something even stronger than the soldier he'd once been. Not a man defined by violence, but a man defined by his unshakable refusal to let fear win, by his willingness to stand between danger and the people he loved, no matter the cost to himself. Silver Creek had been saved not by weapons or intimidation, but by the simple, unbreakable truth that real family chosen, or blood brothers in leather vests, or a mother and son who needed someone steady to lean on, will always answer the call when it matters most. And as the fire crackled low in the pit at the center of the gathering, as Cooper finally fell asleep against Emily's shoulder, as old friends and new ones raised their glasses to a town that had fought for its soul and won, William Carter understood with complete and unshakable certainty that he was finally fully home. Not because he had stopped running, but because he had finally found the courage to stop hiding from who he truly was, a protector, a brother, a man whose quiet strength had saved not just himself, but every single person fortunate enough to call Silver Creek their home. And that in the end was a victory no one could ever take away from him again.